My name is Anna, and at 34 years old, I watched my husband of 10 years slide divorce papers across our kitchen island. Next to him stood my own younger sister, glowing with a secret they had been hiding for months. They thought an ultrasound picture of twins would break me into a million pieces. They expected tears and screaming. Instead, I quietly signed the papers and handed them back because they had no idea I had already sold the very penthouse they were standing in. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family who underestimated your worth. As a senior forensic accountant, my entire career is built on finding discrepancies, tracking hidden assets, and uncovering the truth when people try to lie. I look at balance sheets and see the stories people try to bury. I spend my days dissecting corporate fraud and exposing executives who think they are smarter than the paper trail they leave behind. But for 10 years, I had completely missed the massive lie living inside my own home. The afternoon sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of our Chicago penthouse, casting long, bright shadows across the white granite kitchen island. Everything in the room was spotless and perfectly arranged, reflecting the successful life I had worked so hard to build. I was sitting on a velvet bar stool reviewing a stack of financial portfolios for my clients when the front door opened. David walked in first. He was 35 but carried himself with the arrogant swagger of a much younger man. When we first met, he was a struggling sales representative with big dreams and a kind smile. Over the years, as my income skyrocketed and provided us with a life of luxury, his kindness had slowly warped into pure entitlement. Close behind him was Rachel, my 32-year-old sister. She had always been the center of attention in our family. Growing up, Rachel was the beautiful, free-spirited golden child who could do no wrong. If I earned an academic scholarship, my parents would barely nod, but if Rachel managed to keep a retail job for a month, they would take her out to an expensive dinner to celebrate. David did not say hello. He marched straight to the kitchen island and casually tossed a glossy strip of paper onto the granite surface. It landed right on top of my client files. I looked down and saw the unmistakable black and white blur of a sonogram. Two distinct small shapes were clearly visible in the image. Twins. My heart stopped beating for a fraction of a second. For 10 years, David and I had struggled to conceive. We had spent countless hours in sterile clinic waiting rooms, enduring invasive tests, hormonal injections, and silent heartbreaking car rides, home after every negative result. My career had been the only thing that kept me grounded while my body supposedly failed us. Every month, David would sigh heavily and look at me with a mixture of pity and resentment, making me feel entirely responsible for our empty guest room. I looked up from the photograph. Rachel stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with my husband. She was wearing a perfectly rehearsed look of apologetic triumph. She rested one hand gently on her stomach, playing the part of the glowing mother-to-be. It was a familiar expression. I had seen that exact same look on her face when we were teenagers, and she was caught wearing my favorite stolen dresses. Our mother would always say I needed to be more generous and share with my younger sister. First it was my clothes, then it was my parents' attention, and now it was my husband. "Sign the divorce papers, Anna," David demanded. His voice was completely devoid of the warmth I had known for a decade. He dropped a thick manila folder onto the counter, sliding it across the smooth stone until it bumped against my coffee mug. "Rachel is giving me the family you never could. It is twins." The cruelty of his words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. He had deliberately weaponized my deepest insecurity. He had taken the most painful experience of my adult life, our inability to have a child, and used it as a blade to cut me down. He expected me to shatter. He had positioned himself perfectly to be the frustrated, long-suffering husband who finally found happiness elsewhere. He wanted me to scream and throw things. He wanted to feel like the victim of an unstable wife so he could justify his ultimate betrayal. I took a slow, deep breath and let the silence stretch out between us. The penthouse was so quiet I could hear the faint hum of the stainless steel refrigerator. My mind, an analytical machine trained to detach emotion from facts, went completely cold. The grief and shock that should have paralyzed me were instantly compartmentalized, pushed down, and replaced by pure calculating logic. I looked at David, noticing the expensive designer watch on his wrist, a watch I had purchased for his birthday. I looked at Rachel, noticing the smug satisfaction hiding just behind her fake sympathetic eyes. I remained seated. I did not break down. I did not scream. I did not beg for an explanation or ask how long this affair had been going on. The details of their romance did not matter to me anymore. The only thing that mattered was the paperwork resting in front of me. I reached into my blazer pocket and pulled out my favorite pen. It was a heavy gold-plated instrument I had bought for myself after making senior partner at my financial firm. I placed my hand on the thick manila folder and opened it. I flipped past the pages of standard legal jargon, ignoring the clauses and conditions until I reached the final signature line. My hands did not shake. My breathing was perfectly even. I pressed the tip of the pen to the paper and signed my name with smooth, precise strokes. The scratching sound of the ink on the page echoed loudly in the tense room. David frowned. His confident posture faltered just a fraction. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, exchanging a confused, nervous glance with Rachel. My absolute lack of emotion was deeply unsettling to them. They had prepared for a massive, dramatic war, and I had just surrendered the battlefield without firing a single shot. They thought they had won. They thought they were walking away with everything. What they did not understand was that a forensic accountant does not surrender. We simply audit the situation, assess the liabilities, and eliminate the bad investments. David was a bad investment. I closed the manila folder and slid it back across the granite counter toward him. I carefully capped my pen and placed it back into the inside pocket of my blazer. I folded my hands together and looked up at the man I had loved for 10 years. Then I looked at the sister I had protected my entire life. I looked down at my watch, checking the exact time. "Congratulations on the twins," I said, my voice completely flat and devoid of any warmth. I looked directly into David's eyes, watching the confusion deepen in his expression. "You have exactly 3 hours to pack your bags. I sold this condo yesterday." David stared at me. For a long moment, the only sound was the low hum of city traffic drifting up from the streets below. His perfectly rehearsed smile dissolved. The confident posture he had walked in with evaporated, leaving behind a man who looked very small and confused. He blinked rapidly, looking from my face to the signed divorce papers and back again. The reality of my words took a few seconds to penetrate his arrogance. When it finally did, his smug demeanor shattered into red-faced outrage. He stepped forward and slammed his hand down hard on the granite kitchen island. The heavy thud caused Rachel to jump backward, but I did not even flinch. He leaned over the counter, his face inches from mine, his voice rising to a frantic shout. He told me I was insane. He declared that I could not just sell our home without his permission. He reminded me that as my husband of 10 years, he was legally entitled to exactly 50% of the equity in our multi-million-dollar property. He shouted that he knew his rights and that no court in the state of Illinois would let me throw the father of unborn twins out onto the street. Rachel recovered from her shock and chimed in. She stepped up beside David, placing a protective hand on his arm, glaring at me with pure venom. She accused me of being a bitter, vindictive woman. She claimed my actions were illegal and that I was lashing out because I was jealous of her pregnancy. She said I was trying to punish them for finding true love and creating the family I was never capable of giving him. Her voice echoed through the pristine kitchen as she painted herself as the innocent victim. I let them yell. I watched them exhaust themselves, tossing out legal threats and emotional insults, trying to regain control of a narrative that had already slipped through their fingers. When they finally ran out of breath, I reached down and lifted my leather-bound briefcase onto the granite counter. The brass clasps clicked loudly as I opened it. My hands moved with practiced precision. I was no longer a betrayed wife in a kitchen. I was a senior forensic accountant in an interrogation room. I reached into the organized compartments of my briefcase and withdrew a thick stack of bank statements, loan applications, and property records. Every page was heavily annotated with bright yellow highlighter and red ink. I placed the stack squarely in front of David, covering the glossy ultrasound photo he had thrown at me earlier. I looked at him and explained that he had forgotten what I do for a living. People pay me thousands of dollars an hour to find money wealthy executives try to hide. I trace offshore accounts and untangle complex corporate deceit. I asked if he honestly believed he was smart enough to hide financial fraud from me inside my own house. David looked down at the highlighted documents, and all the color drained from his face. He recognized the logo of the lending bank immediately. 6 months ago, you decided your standard lifestyle was not enough, I said. You took out a massive second mortgage on this property to fund your luxury car leases and cover the credit card debt you racked up buying gifts for Rachel. You maxed out the equity we built over a decade. Because my name is on the deed, you needed my permission, so you forged my initials on the closing documents. David opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Rachel looked at him in sheer panic, suddenly realizing that the wealthy, successful man she thought she was stealing was actually drowning in a sea of hidden debt. I continued speaking, keeping my tone perfectly level. I explained that I noticed the discrepancy in our credit monitoring report 3 months ago. It took me less than 2 days to pull the original lending documents and verify the forged signatures. It took me another week to trace the flow of the borrowed funds directly to the dealership where he leased his new sports car and to the luxury boutiques where he purchased jewelry for Rachel. You thought you were so clever, David, I said. You thought I was too busy with my clients to notice you bleeding our assets dry. But once I found the fraud, I knew exactly what kind of man I was dealing with. I knew I needed to protect myself from the legal and financial mess you created. I tapped the top page of the stack. I explained that because the second mortgage was obtained through documented fraud, I was legally able to isolate my remaining financial interests. I hired the best asset protection attorneys in the city. To protect myself from your financial crimes, I legally transferred all of my remaining personal equity and assets into an impenetrable blind trust. You cannot touch a single dime of my money, David. I watched his eyes dart wildly across the documents, trying to find a loophole, a mistaken out. There was none. I had spent months quietly sealing every exit. The sale of this penthouse closed yesterday afternoon, I continued. The new owners are a corporate holding company, and they expect the property to be vacant by 5 o'clock today. The building security team has already been notified. If you are not gone by the time they arrive, they will physically remove you for trespassing. David stared at me, his chest heaving as he struggled to process the absolute destruction of his reality. He told me I could not do this. He begged me to be reasonable, claiming we needed to split everything fairly. He tried to reach for my hand, but I pulled it away. You are not entitled to half the equity, David, I said, delivering the final blow. Because of your forgery and the blind trust, you are only entitled to the debt you created. You owe the bank hundreds of thousands of dollars. You have no home, no assets, and no wife. You are leaving this marriage exactly how you entered it. Broke. The silence that followed was heavy. The illusion of their triumphant new life had been dismantled in less than 5 minutes. Rachel took a step away from David, her eyes wide with terror as she realized the wealthy future she envisioned was actually a mountain of crippling debt. She looked around the penthouse, understanding that none of this belonged to the man standing next to her. David looked completely defeated. The arrogant smirk was gone, replaced by the panicked expression of a cornered animal. He looked at the signed divorce papers, then at the highlighted bank statements, and finally at the door. He realized I held all the cards, and that any attempt to fight me would only result in me handing the forgery evidence directly to the police. He was effectively homeless and buried in debt. Without saying another word, David turned around and grabbed his hastily packed bags. He shoved past Rachel and marched toward the front door, his face red with shame and fury. Rachel scrambled to follow him, her designer heels clicking frantically against the hardwood floor. She cast one last look back at me, a look of pure hatred mixed with sudden, desperate fear. I sat at the kitchen island and watched the heavy wooden door slam shut behind them. They were gone. I knew exactly where they were heading. David had no money and no friends who would take him in. He would speed off with Rachel to the home of his mother to secure a place to stay. He would run to his parent, eager to announce the pregnancy and play the victim seeking validation for his choices. How was rushing so blindly toward a safe harbor, completely unaware of the devastating medical time bomb waiting patiently for him the very moment he walked through the front door of his childhood home. The drive from downtown Chicago to the affluent northern suburbs felt like a frantic blur. He gripped the steering wheel tightly while his mind raced to construct a narrative that painted him as the victim. Beside him in the passenger seat, Rachel remained completely silent. She kept one hand resting on her stomach, practicing the role of the innocent expecting mother. They were running from the absolute humiliation they had just suffered. David desperately needed validation. He needed someone to tell him losing his multi-million-dollar lifestyle was simply the price he had to pay for a real family. He pulled into the sweeping driveway of his mother's suburban estate. Barbara was a woman who prided herself on maintaining a perfect, peaceful household. Her home represented everything David was trying to hold on to. He parked and marched up the front walkway, pulling Rachel by the hand. He shoved the heavy oak front door open and called out for his mother, his voice echoing through the foyer. Barbara was standing in her pristine kitchen. Sunlight illuminated the spotless granite countertops and polished hardwood floors. She was holding a steaming ceramic coffee mug in both hands. She turned around with a warm, welcoming smile. That smile was the exact sanctuary David sought. He did not ease into the conversation or offer any gentle transition. Driven by his bruised ego, he launched the news across the kitchen like a weapon. He announced his marriage was over. He stated proudly that Anna had thrown them out, but it did not matter, because Anna was completely broken inside. He told his mother Anna had been too barren to ever give them a family, and he was done waiting for a miracle that would never come. He pulled Rachel forward, positioning her in the center of the kitchen. He pointed directly to her neck, his chest swelling with pride. He boasted Rachel was finally giving the family the bloodline they deserved. He announced that she was pregnant with his children and that they were expecting twins. He stood tall, waiting for his mother to rush forward with tears of joy. He expected Barbara to embrace Rachel, to condemn Anna, and to celebrate this ultimate victory of fertility and new life. Rachel mirrored his posture. She stood in the bright kitchen wearing a smug, self-satisfied smile. She tilted her chin up slightly, waiting to be crowned the savior of the family. But Barbara did not step forward. She did not smile. She did not offer congratulations or open her arms. Barbara froze completely. The warm, welcoming expression vanished from her face, replaced by a look of absolute sheer terror. The color drained from her cheeks so rapidly that her skin turned a sickly, translucent shade of gray. She stared at Rachel's stomach, and then her eyes darted wildly up to Rachel's smug face. She did not look at her son. Her gaze was locked entirely on the woman claiming to carry his children. The silence in the kitchen became heavy and unnatural. The ceramic coffee mug slipped from Barbara's trembling fingers. It fell through the air in what felt like agonizing slow motion. It struck the polished hardwood floor with a sharp, violent crack, shattering into dozens of jagged pieces. Hot, dark coffee splashed across the pristine wood and splattered over the tips of her shoes. Barbara did not even flinch. She did not look down at the mess spreading across her perfect floor. She just kept staring at Rachel with eyes wide with horror. David frowned, his own triumphant smile faltering. The reaction was entirely wrong. He took a step toward his mother, crushing a piece of broken ceramic beneath his shoe. He asked her what was wrong. He assumed the shock of the sudden divorce and the pregnancy announcement had simply overwhelmed her. He reached out a hand, trying to soothe the woman he thought was just startled by the rapid change in his life. Barbara finally tore her gaze away from Rachel and looked at her son. Her chest heaved as she struggled to pull air into her lungs. When she finally managed to speak, her voice was barely more than a ragged, hoarse whisper. "Wait." Barbara gasped, her entire body shaking. "She did not tell you." David stopped walking. His hand dropped to his side. The confusion on his face deepened into genuine bewilderment. He looked over his shoulder at Rachel, who suddenly looked very rigid. He turned back to his mother and asked what she was talking about. He asked what Rachel was supposed to have told him. Barbara reached out and gripped the edge of the granite kitchen island. Her knuckles turned stark white as she used the heavy stone to keep her knees from buckling. Tears immediately flooded her eyes, spilling over her lashes and running down her pale cheeks. She looked at her son with a mixture of profound heartbreak and desperate pity. "David," Barbara said, her voice cracking under the weight of the secret she was about to unearth, "you have to listen to me very carefully. I need you to think back to the summer when you were 12 years old." David stared at her, completely lost. He did not understand why she was bringing up his childhood in the middle of a pregnancy announcement. "You were terribly sick that summer," Barbara continued, the tears now flowing freely down her face. "You contracted a severe case of the mumps. The fever was dangerously high and the complications were catastrophic. You were in the hospital for 2 weeks." David nodded slowly. He remembered being sick. He remembered the hospital room and the endless parade of doctors. But he still could not grasp how a childhood illness connected to the twins Rachel was carrying. "You were too young to fully understand what the doctors were doing at the time," Barbara said, her voice dropping to a devastated whisper. "They had to perform a surgical biopsy. They ran extensive clinical tests to check the long-term damage the infection had caused to your reproductive system. Your father and I sat in that doctor's office and listened as they read the final laboratory results." Rachel took a slow, careful step backward toward the front door. The smug satisfaction had completely vanished from her face, replaced by a sudden trapped panic. "The damage was absolute, David," Barbara sobbed, finally speaking the agonizing truth she had protected him from for over 2 decades. "The doctors told us there was no chance. You do not have a low sperm count. You have a 0 sperm count. The infection destroyed everything." The kitchen seemed to stop spinning. The sunlight pouring through the windows suddenly felt cold and sterile. David stopped breathing. The words hung in the air, suspended between the three of them like a physical weight. "Wait, you are completely and unconditionally sterile," Barbara wept, clutching the edge of the granite counter. "You have been 100% sterile your entire life." The words hit David with the force of a freight train. His mind struggled to process the sheer biological impossibility of the situation. He looked down at the shattered coffee mug on the floor and then slowly turned his head to look at Rachel. The woman he had just destroyed his marriage for was standing completely still, her hands trembling at her sides. The absolute mathematical impossibility of the twins crashed down upon him. He had absolutely no sperm. He had never had any sperm. He could not create life. Rachel's glorious medical miracle was a calculated and entirely malicious lie. The grand, sprawling kitchen instantly plunged into a very suffocating, heavy silence. The illusion of his triumphant new family completely evaporated, leaving nothing but the cold, hard truth. David just stared at Rachel as the horrific reality of her ultimate betrayal began to dawn on him. While David was standing in that suburban kitchen watching his entire world crumble, I was miles away, breathing the first truly clean air I had tasted in a decade. The transition from my former life to my new reality was swift. I had booked a luxury suite at the Four Seasons in downtown Chicago. The hotel offered a level of pristine quiet that felt like an absolute sanctuary after the stifling atmosphere of the penthouse. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my suite, looking out over the magnificent skyline and Lake Michigan. The water was a deep, churning blue under the late afternoon sun. I felt an unexpected, profound sense of peace. There were no tears left to cry over a man who had so easily discarded 10 years of marriage. I had mourned the death of our relationship months ago when I first suspected his financial deceit. Today was simply the administrative conclusion of a failed partnership. I turned away from the window and walked over to the plush velvet sofa where my leather briefcase rested. I needed coffee. Real strong coffee before I began the tedious process of organizing my temporary life and updating my personal security protocols. I slipped on my blazer, grabbed my keycard, and took the private elevator down to the main lobby. The grand lobby of the Four Seasons was a masterpiece of polished marble, towering floral arrangements, and hushed, sophisticated conversations. It was a place designed for discretion and comfort. That discretion was violently shattered the moment the elevator doors parted. I stepped out into the opulent space and immediately heard the sharp, aggressive clicking of high heels striking the marble floor at a frantic pace. I did not even have to look up to know who was approaching. I recognized that angry, entitled cadence instantly. I stopped walking and braced myself as my mother Susan stormed past the beautifully carved mahogany concierge desk. She was 60 years old, but dressed like a woman desperately trying to hold on to her youth, wearing a designer trench coat and oversized sunglasses that she whipped off her face as she zeroed in on me. Her expression was contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She marched directly toward me, ignoring the startled glances of the wealthy hotel guests and the polite staff. She did not reach out to hug me. She did not ask how I was doing or offer a single word of maternal comfort to a daughter whose marriage had just violently imploded. She stopped inches from my face, her chest heaving with indignation. "How could you do it, Anna?" she demanded, her voice echoing loudly through the elegant lobby. "How could you be so incredibly vicious and cruel? You left your own pregnant sister and David completely homeless on the street." I stared at her, letting the sheer audacity of her accusation wash over me. I had fully expected her to take Rachel's side. She had taken Rachel's side in every single conflict since we were children. But the speed at which she had mobilized to attack me was staggering. David and Rachel must have called her the second they fled the penthouse, spinning a pathetic tale of woe. "They are not homeless, Mother," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly level and refusing to match her hysterical volume. "They are adults who made choices. I simply removed myself from the financial burden of their mistakes. They can figure out their own housing." Susan scoffed, waving her hand dismissively, as if my betrayal was a minor inconvenience compared to her golden child's current predicament. She stepped closer, pointing a manicured finger at my chest. "You threw them out of their own home," she hissed, her eyes flashing with righteous fury. "Rachel called me, sobbing hysterically. She is carrying your husband's children, Anna. She is finally giving our family the beautiful grandchildren we have all been waiting for. You chose your spreadsheets and your corporate career over building a family, so it is your absolute duty to support hers." The words hung in the air between us, toxic and suffocating. Through her aggressive, demanding dialogue, the deep-seated dynamic of our entire family history was laid bare for anyone to see. Rachel was the beautiful, fertile golden child who was providing the ultimate prize. I was the cold, barren scapegoat whose only value was my bank account. Susan did not care that Rachel was sleeping with my husband. She did not care about the profound betrayal, the shattered vows, or the emotional devastation I should have been experiencing. She only saw the situation as a logistical problem that my money needed to fix. I looked at the woman who had raised me and felt a cold knot form in my stomach. She was not just enabling the affair. She was actively trying to extort me to finance it. "I expect you to pay for her premium maternity ward," Susan continued, her voice rising even louder, drawing the attention of a nearby security guard. "Rachel needs the best care possible. She cannot be stressed about money right now. You have millions hidden away in your little accounts. You are going to write a check today to cover their new housing and all of her medical expenses. It is the absolute least you can do after treating them so horribly." I let her finish her ridiculous demands. I looked around the lobby, noticing the security guard taking a tentative step forward, ready to intervene. I held up a hand, signaling that I had the situation under control. Then I looked back at my mother, meeting her furious gaze with absolute chilling detachment. "Mother," I said, my voice dropping to a calm, dangerous register, "listen to me very carefully, because I will only say this once. I do not care if Rachel gives birth to the second coming. I do not care if David has to sleep in his leased sports car. I am not funding your golden child's betrayal. I will not give you, David or Rachel, a single solitary cent." Susan gasped, her mouth dropping open in genuine shock. She was completely unaccustomed to me denying her direct demands. For years I had played the role of the dutiful daughter, desperately trying to earn her approval by paying for family vacations and bailing Rachel out of minor debts. She expected me to fold under her public pressure. "You are a monster!" Susan spat, her face flushing a deep, angry red. "You have a black heart, Anna. You are just jealous because Rachel is a real woman who can actually give a man what he needs. You are going to die alone with your money." I smiled. It was not a happy smile, but a cold, calculated expression that made my mother physically recoil. "I would rather die alone with my money than live surrounded by parasites," I replied smoothly. "Now you need to leave this hotel immediately before I have security physically remove you for harassment. Do not ever approach me in public again." I did not wait for her response. I turned my back on her entirely and walked gracefully toward the elevator bank. I could hear her gasping behind me, sputtering indignant insults and demanding that I come back and show her some respect. I ignored her completely. The heavy brass doors of the elevator slid open, and I stepped inside, pressing the button for the penthouse level. As the doors closed, I caught one final glimpse of my mother standing in the middle of the lobby, her face contorted with impotent rage, while the security guard firmly directed her toward the exit. The elevator ascended smoothly, carrying me away from the toxic noise. As the numbers above the door climbed higher, the adrenaline in my veins began to shift. The confrontation had clarified everything. My family was not just complicit in my husband's affair, they were active participants in a coordinated effort to bleed me dry. They thought they could use guilt and social pressure to manipulate me into opening my checkbook. They thought I would simply roll over and accept my designated role as the financial sponsor of Rachel's perfect new life. They had severely miscalculated. I stepped out of the elevator and walked down the quiet, plushly carpeted hallway to my suite. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, relocking it securely behind me. The luxurious silence of the room wrapped around me again, but this time I was not looking for peace. I was looking for destruction. I walked directly to the mahogany desk near the window and sat down. I opened my leather briefcase and pulled out my high-performance laptop, flipping the screen open. The soft glow of the monitor illuminated my face. If my mother wanted to play financial games to protect her golden child, I was more than willing to oblige. I cracked my knuckles and placed my fingers over the keyboard. I was about to show them exactly how a senior forensic accountant dismantles a life piece by piece. I started with the most obvious target. Rachel had always paraded her highly successful boutique Pilates studio as definitive proof that she was just as capable as I was, but without the corporate soullessness. My parents constantly bragged about her entrepreneurial spirit, using her studio as a weapon to diminish my corporate achievements. I knew Rachel's business model inside and out, and I knew there was no way a small suburban fitness studio was generating the kind of revenue required to support her lavish lifestyle. I bypassed the standard public firewalls, utilizing professional tracing software I routinely used for corporate audits. I accessed the shared tax portals and state business registries, pulling the public filings for her limited liability company. Within an hour, the pristine illusion of Rachel's successful business completely collapsed on my screen. The truth was glaringly obvious. Rachel's studio was drowning in over $200,000 of hidden commercial debt. She was 3 months behind on her lease and had maxed out multiple high-interest business credit cards just to keep the lights on. But the debt was not the most interesting part. My trained eyes scanned the digital ledgers looking for the life support system keeping her afloat. I navigated to the deposit histories of her personal checking accounts, which were linked to the business operations. As I scrolled through the endless columns of numbers, I caught a glaring anomaly that made my heart race with anticipation. There was a pattern, a very specific, highly calculated pattern of income that had absolutely nothing to do with Pilates classes or athletic apparel sales. For the past 14 months, Rachel had been receiving consistent monthly wire transfers of exactly $10,000. The deposits were systematically categorized under the vague guise of private consulting fees. I tracked the routing numbers cross-referencing the transaction dates and the clearinghouses. These massive transfers were not coming from David, who was drowning in his own luxury vehicle debt. They certainly were not coming from our mother, whose own finances I knew were tied up in her suburban mortgage. I did not stop at the routing screen. A transfer pattern is only useful when it can be connected to a real business reality. So I began rebuilding Rachel's studio from the inside out. I pulled the last 24 months of sales tax filings, merchant processor summaries, payroll reports, landlord notices, equipment leases, and insurance payments. The numbers told a very different story from the one Rachel posted online. Her social media accounts showed packed reformer classes, celebrity clients, and waitlists stretching for weeks. The bank data showed something closer to collapse. Most weekday classes generated fewer than 6 paid bookings. Several of the photographs she used to advertise sold-out sessions had been taken during free promotional events. She repeatedly counted complimentary memberships as revenue projections, even though no money had entered the account. Her retail line of branded leggings had produced less than $12,000 in annual sales, while storage, shipping, and unsold inventory had cost almost 3 times that amount. I opened a spreadsheet and began reconciling every claimed source of income against actual deposits. The gap widened by the month. Rachel had reported impressive gross revenue to our mother and to potential investors, but her tax filings showed shrinking receipts. She had also delayed payroll taxes twice and used one business credit card to make minimum payments on another. The studio landlord had issued 3 notices demanding overdue rent. A financing company had already filed a lien against the reformer equipment. One more missed payment would allow them to enter the studio and remove nearly everything required to operate. The $200,000 in commercial debt was not an estimate. It was a documented countdown. I checked the dates of Rachel's largest personal purchases. Designer handbags, resort weekends, cosmetic treatments, and private car services appeared within 48 hours of the mysterious transfers. The money was not being invested in the studio. It was sustaining the public image of a successful entrepreneur, while the actual company suffocated beneath unpaid bills. Next, I examined the description attached to each $10,000 deposit. Private consulting fees sounded respectable, but there were no corresponding invoices, contracts, client reports, or tax forms. Rachel had no consulting license, since no corporate advisory clients, and no specialized service that justified a 6-figure annual payment. I searched the studio email domain through archived metadata available in the shared business portal. There was no evidence she had ever delivered work to the company sending the money. I created a second timeline and placed every transfer beside Rachel's calendar. The pattern became even more revealing. On most deposit dates, Rachel had either canceled her afternoon classes or arranged for an assistant to close the studio. Her credit card records then placed her at downtown restaurants, luxury hotels, or private parking garages, nowhere near her suburban business. Several of those locations were within walking distance of buildings owned by the same commercial real estate conglomerate. I felt the first cold edge of certainty settle into place. For 14 months, someone had been paying Rachel exactly enough to maintain her lifestyle and prevent her business from collapsing, but not enough to make her financially independent. The arrangement created control. If the payment stopped, the studio failed. If the studio failed, Rachel lost the identity she used to impress our mother and compete with me. Whoever was sending the money understood that pressure perfectly. I downloaded the deposit records and examined the wire instructions line by line. The first transfers had passed through a domestic clearing bank. Later payments were routed through 2 intermediary accounts before reaching Rachel. That change suggested the sender had become more cautious. I compared the shift in routing with public dates from Rachel's life. The extra layer appeared shortly after she began spending more evenings away from the studio and shortly before David started inventing reasons to come home late. I searched for recurring phone payments and discovered a second prepaid number buried among Rachel's business expenses. The account had been opened 14 months earlier. The same week, the first $10,000 transfer arrived. It was funded automatically through her studio debit card, but never appeared in the contact records she shared with our family. I could not legally access the message content, and I did not need to. The timing alone helped establish that the financial arrangement and the secret relationship began together. Then I found the tax problem. Rachel had reported the transfers as consulting income on one quarterly statement as owner contributions on another, and omitted several deposits entirely. The inconsistent classifications were not random bookkeeping errors. They were attempts to prevent any single reviewer from seeing the complete annual amount. I exported the filings into my audit program and normalized the categories. The hidden payments totaled $140,000 before fees. Added to her unexplained luxury expenses, they formed a financial profile no legitimate Pilates studio could support. I sat back and looked through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the hotel suite. The city lights were beginning to appear across Chicago orderly from a distance. On my screen, Rachel's life looked the same way until every transaction was placed in sequence. Then the deception became impossible to miss. I thought about the confidence with which she had stood beside David in my kitchen. She had not looked like a woman taking a reckless chance. She had looked like someone who believed every risk had already been financed and contained. David was not the source of that confidence. He could barely cover the payments on his leased car. Rachel had another provider, one wealthy enough to send $10,000 every month and sophisticated enough to hide behind multiple financial layers. I reviewed our mother's accounts to eliminate the possibility that Susan had secretly financed the studio. Her cash flow was strained and heavily dependent on home equity. I reviewed the transfers David had made to Rachel. They were embarrassing but small jewelry purchases, restaurant charges, and occasional cash withdrawals. None came close to explaining the regular deposits. That left an outside benefactor. I opened the original wire detail again and isolated the correspondent bank code. The identifier connected to a financial institution known for servicing private wealth structures and political donors. From there, I followed the transaction chain through a registered agent, a legal billing account, and a corporate service provider. Each layer was designed to appear unrelated to the next. Each one also charged a fee that showed up on a predictable schedule. I marked every connection in red. The transfer did not originate from David Susan, a studio customer, or any ordinary consulting client. It came through a protected shell company whose registration records had been deliberately buried behind professional agents and a Wilmington mailing address. The entity had no employees, no website, no operating history, and no visible commercial purpose beyond moving money. The company was registered in Delaware. Rachel was hiding a massive secret, and I was going to rip it wide open. I stared at the glowing screen of my laptop, letting the reality of the offshore shell company sink into my mind. A boutique Pilates instructor from the Chicago suburbs does not accidentally stumble into receiving $10,000 a month from a Delaware-based corporate entity. People use those types of financial structures for one specific reason, and that is to hide their identities completely. I opened a new secure tab on my browser and launched the advanced tracing software I normally reserved for unmasking international corporate embezzlement. My fingers flew across the keyboard, typing in strings of commands to pull the public registration records for the LLC. The initial results were exactly what I expected to find. The company was hidden behind a registered agent service, a common tactic used to shield the true owners from public scrutiny. The listed address was just a meaningless post office box in Wilmington, Delaware. But every financial entity leaves a digital footprint, no matter how much money they spend trying to sweep away their tracks. I cross-referenced the employer identification number with federal tax databases, looking for any overlapping corporate officers or shared legal counsel. The search required patience. I sat in the quiet luxury of my hotel suite, the only sound being the rapid clicking of my keys. After 45 minutes of digging through layers of bureaucratic obfuscation, I found my first real thread. The registered agent for the Delaware LLC shared a primary billing address with a massive commercial real estate conglomerate headquartered right here in Chicago. The financial wall was beginning to crumble under my scrutiny. I ran a secondary search on the real estate conglomerate, pulling their annual reports and executive board summaries. The corporate structure was incredibly complex, featuring dozens of subsidiary companies and holding groups designed to funnel money upward. But all those intricate financial rivers flowed into one single massive ocean. I traced the ultimate ownership of the conglomerate back to a sole proprietor. The name appeared on my screen in stark black and white text. Kevin was not just a wealthy businessman. He was a 55-year-old billionaire real estate tycoon with a massive public profile. I leaned back in my chair, letting out a slow breath as I processed the magnitude of the name on my screen. Everyone in the city knew who Kevin was. His face was currently plastered on billboards and television commercials across the entire state. He was in the final critical weeks of a highly publicized, aggressive campaign for a prominent local political office. His entire political platform was built on the foundation of traditional family values, moral integrity, and restoring conservative ethics to the local government. He was a man who paraded his wife and his 3 college-aged children at every single rally, using his pristine family image as his primary selling point to the voters. Any hint of a scandal right now would not just be a minor inconvenience. It would be a catastrophic, career-ending explosion that would instantly incinerate his political aspirations and cost him millions in campaign investments. I opened another tab and searched for images of Kevin looking at his perfectly tailored suits and his manufactured political smile. The pieces of the puzzle began to snap together with absolutely horrifying clarity. The random $10,000 monthly payments were not consulting fees for fitness advice. They were hush money. I looked at the timeline of the wire transfers, comparing the dates to Kevin's political campaign announcements. The payments had started exactly 14 months ago, right around the time Kevin first formed his exploratory committee for public office. Rachel had been on his payroll, keeping her mouth shut and playing the part of the successful independent business owner while secretly serving as a billionaire's hidden mistress. But the hush money alone did not explain the pregnancy or the sudden violent end to my marriage. I needed to understand why Rachel had decided to involve David. I pulled up a digital notepad and began constructing a timeline of events, mapping out the intersections of Rachel's financial windfalls, Kevin's political milestones, and David's desperate desire for a family. My mind worked with cold clinical precision, stripping away the emotional connections and viewing my sister and my ex-husband merely as variables in a very dark equation. The horrific truth began to emerge from the data. Rachel had gotten pregnant by her billionaire sugar daddy, right in the middle of the most important political campaign of his entire life. An illegitimate child would completely destroy Kevin's family values platform and end his marriage to a woman who reportedly held significant wealth and power of her own. Kevin needed the problem to disappear entirely. I stared at the screen, realizing that Rachel had likely tried to use the pregnancy to extort a massive permanent settlement from him. But she had a glaring problem. A sudden, unexplained pregnancy in a single woman would draw unwanted questions and potential media scrutiny, especially given her proximity to a high-profile political figure. Rachel needed a completely foolproof cover story. She needed a legitimate, respectable facade to explain her pregnancy to the world and completely insulate Kevin from any suspicion. She needed a gullible, desperate biological scapegoat. She chose my husband. The sheer evil brilliance of her plan made my blood run cold. David had spent 10 years agonizing over our inability to have a child. His ego was deeply bruised, and his desperation made him the perfect easy target. Rachel had likely seduced him, playing on his insecurities and validating his fragile masculinity while feeding him exactly what he wanted to hear. When she announced she was pregnant, she handed him the ultimate prize. She convinced David that he was the father, knowing he would never question a miracle that stroked his ego so perfectly. She convinced him to throw away his 10-year marriage, knowing he would happily destroy my life if it meant he finally got to play the role of the proud father. David thought he had won the ultimate victory. He honestly believed he was walking away from our marriage to start a beautiful new life with a younger, fertile woman who adored him. He had absolutely no idea that he was nothing more than a convenient human shield for a billionaire's political scandal. Rachel had used my husband to launder her illegitimate pregnancy, masking her extortion scheme behind the illusion of a tragic but romantic family betrayal. She got to keep her wealthy lover's hush money, maintain her social standing, and secure a free place to live by stealing my husband, all while punishing me for years of perceived slights. The audacity was truly staggering. She thought she had executed the perfect crime. She assumed I would simply cry over my broken heart and retreat into my work, leaving her free to enjoy the spoils of her deceit. She never stopped to consider that stealing the husband of a senior forensic accountant might invite a level of financial scrutiny she could not possibly survive. I had the complete, unvarnished truth sitting right in front of me, backed by irrefutable financial data. I felt a surge of cold, powerful adrenaline course through my veins. I was no longer a victim weeping over a failed marriage. I was the architect of their impending destruction. I reached out and clicked the download button on my browser. A small progress bar appeared on my screen as I initiated the secure transfer of all the compiled evidence. I downloaded the offshore shell company registration documents, the routing numbers, the tax discrepancies, and the complete history of the $10,000 wire transfers flowing directly into Rachel's accounts. I compiled the timeline of Kevin's political campaign and cross-referenced it with the financial anomalies, creating an undeniable digital dossier of their illicit arrangement. I saved the entire packet onto an encrypted external hard drive, severing their ability to ever deny the truth. I watched the progress bar hit 100%, feeling a profound sense of satisfaction. The proof was secured. Just as the download completion notification chimed softly from my computer speakers, my personal cell phone vibrated violently against the mahogany desk. I picked up the device expecting to see another frantic, harassing message from my mother, or perhaps a desperate, angry text from David demanding money. Instead, the screen illuminated with a secure, encrypted message from a completely unknown number. I stared at the bright white text glowing against the dark background of the screen. The message was short, direct, and chillingly precise. It read, "I know exactly what your sister is doing to my husband. Meet me tomorrow." I read the words 3 times, letting the reality of the message settle into my bones. A slow, very cold smile spread across my face as I realized I was no longer fighting this brutal, silent war alone. The game had just changed completely and forever. The silence in the kitchen stretched on, feeling thick enough to choke on. David kept his eyes locked on Rachel, watching the muscles in her neck tighten as she swallowed hard. The smug confidence she had carried into the house was completely gone, replaced by the frantic energy of someone calculating her next move. Barbara stood frozen against the granite island, her face still pale and streaked with tears. The shattered coffee mug on the floor remained untouched, a physical representation of the catastrophic damage that had just been done. David finally found his voice. It came out as a low, dangerous rasp that vibrated in his chest. He took a slow, hesitant step toward the woman he had destroyed his 10-year marriage to be with. He asked her to tell him the truth. He demanded to know whose children she was carrying because he knew with absolute certainty that they were not his. Rachel did what she had always done when cornered. She deployed her most reliable weapon. Her lower lip began to tremble violently, and her large eyes filled with instant manufactured tears. She took a step toward David, reaching out with shaking hands to grab his shirt. She cried out that he was overreacting and listening to ancient medical history. The tears spilled over her cheeks in perfect theatrical streams. She insisted that the doctors had told her there was a 1% chance. She grasped his forearms, digging her fingernails into his jacket, playing the role of the desperate, misunderstood mother. She shouted that it was a medical miracle. She begged him to look at her and believe that their love had somehow defied the odds. She asked how he could possibly let his mother and her outdated 30-year-old medical knowledge ruin the beautiful blessing they had just been given. David looked down at her hands, gripping his clothes. His mind was violently tearing itself apart. The logical part of his brain, the part that had negotiated corporate sales contracts, knew that a zero sperm count was not something that miraculously cured itself. But the fragile, deeply bruised ego that had spent a decade feeling inadequate desperately wanted to believe her lies. Before David could formulate a response, the heavy oak front door swung open with tremendous force. The sound of aggressive, hurried footsteps echoed through the foyer. Susan marched into the kitchen, bringing a chaotic, frantic energy into the room. She had driven straight to Barbara's house after being humiliated and thrown out of the luxury hotel lobby by Anna. Her face was flushed dark red, and her designer trench coat was wrinkled. Susan stopped abruptly, taking in the scene before her. She saw Barbara clutching the counter crying. She saw David standing rigid and pale, and she saw her precious golden child Rachel weeping hysterically while clinging to David's jacket. Susan did not ask what had happened. She did not gather facts. She instantly shifted into attack mode, positioning herself as the fierce defender of her favorite daughter. Susan crossed the kitchen, stepping right over the spilled coffee and shattered ceramic. She wrapped her arms protectively around Rachel, pulling the younger woman against her shoulder. Rachel immediately leaned into the embrace, burying her face in her mother's coat and sobbing louder. Susan glared at David and then turned her furious gaze upon Barbara. She demanded to know what Barbara had said to upset a pregnant woman. Barbara, still shaking, tried to explain. She managed to stammer out the truth about the childhood illness, the surgical biopsy, and the permanent sterility. She tried to tell Susan that the twin pregnancy was a complete biological impossibility. Susan did not miss a beat. She did not even pause to consider the medical facts being presented to her. Instead, she launched into a vicious, aggressive campaign of gaslighting designed entirely to protect Rachel's elaborate lie. She laughed, a harsh, mocking sound that echoed terribly in the tense room. She looked at Barbara with pure, unadulterated contempt. She called Barbara a bitter, jealous old woman who could not stand to see her son finally find happiness. She waved her hand dismissively at the story of the childhood illness, declaring that medical science from 3 decades ago was practically archaic. Susan turned her attention back to David, her voice softening into a manipulative, soothing tone. She told him that miracles happen every single day. She reminded him of how much he had always wanted to be a father and how deeply he had suffered while married to a cold, barren woman like Anna. She told him that Anna had likely poisoned his mind and that his mother was simply trying to ruin his joy because she was miserable in her own life. Rachel peeked out from her mother's embrace, nodding enthusiastically. She sniffled and wiped her eyes, telling David that they were meant to be together. She promised him that the babies growing inside her were the ultimate proof of their destiny. She begged him not to abandon his true family, based on the jealous ramblings of a woman who clearly did not understand modern fertility. David stood in the center of the kitchen, surrounded by the two women. The pressure in the room was immense. His entire identity was currently hanging by a very thin, frayed thread. He had literally just lost his multi-million-dollar penthouse, his wealthy wife, and his financial security. If he accepted his mother's truth right now, he would have to admit that he had thrown his entire life away for absolutely nothing. He would have to face the fact that he had been played for an absolute fool by a manipulative woman who was using him to cover up a massive scandal. The humiliation of that reality was simply too much for his fragile ego to bear. He could not stomach the idea of crawling back to Anna defeated and homeless while admitting she had been right all along. The desperation to salvage his pride completely hijacked his sense of logic. He wanted to be a father. He wanted to be the proud, virile man he had always imagined himself to be. David took a slow, deep breath and forced the tension out of his shoulders. He looked at his mother, who was watching him with a heartbreaking expression of desperate sorrow. He could see the absolute truth in her eyes, but he deliberately chose to look away. He turned his attention back to Rachel and Susan, smoothing his expression into a mask of weary acceptance. He reached out and gently pulled Rachel away from her mother's protective embrace. He wrapped his arms around her and pulled her close, burying his face in her hair. He told her that he was sorry for doubting her even for a second. He told Susan that she was right, and that the stress of the brutal divorce had simply clouded his judgment. He declared loudly so his mother would hear every single word that he believed in their miracle and that nobody was going to ruin their beautiful new family. Rachel smiled against his chest, a look of pure triumphant relief washing over her face. Susan beamed with pride, patting David on the back and praising him for being such a strong, dedicated man. She immediately began talking about moving Rachel's belongings into the guest bedroom and making sure the expecting mother was perfectly comfortable. Barbara remained by the kitchen island, leaning heavily against the cold granite. She did not say another word. She just watched her son embrace a terrible, destructive lie because the truth was too painful for him to survive. She knew he was walking blindly into a catastrophe, but she also knew he was completely beyond her reach. Susan and Rachel linked arms and walked out of the kitchen, heading down the hallway to inspect the guest accommodations. Their voices drifted back, carrying the light, excited tone of women planning a nursery. They were completely convinced they had won the battle and secured their safe harbor. David stayed behind in the kitchen. He stood perfectly still, waiting until the sound of their footsteps faded away completely, and he was sure they were out of earshot. He did not look at his mother. The moment he was absolutely certain he was not being watched, the mask of the doting, confident father immediately fell away. His hands began to shake again. The desperate act he had just put on to save his pride did not extinguish the burning, terrifying doubt in his mind. The seed of deep, dark paranoia had been permanently planted, and it was already growing rapidly, taking root in his chest. He knew his mother was not a bitter liar. He knew she had no reason to invent a story about a surgical biopsy. The cold, mathematical impossibility of the situation gnawed at his sanity. He pulled his smartphone out of his jacket pocket. His thumbs moved quickly and silently across the screen. He opened a private browser window and navigated to the website of a highly discreet premium medical facility located in a neighboring suburb. He did not want to leave a single digital footprint that Rachel or Susan could ever find. He clicked on the scheduling portal for the Fertility and Reproductive Health Department. He bypassed the standard consultation options and went straight to the emergency clinical testing services. He selected the most comprehensive semen analysis and genetic screening package available, ensuring the results would be expedited and entirely unquestionable. When the online form prompted him for a patient name, David paused for a fraction of a second. He knew if the results confirmed his worst fears, he would need complete anonymity until he was ready to strike back. He typed in a generic fake nickname and used a secondary email address he kept for spam. He booked the appointment for the earliest available slot the following afternoon. David slid the phone back into his pocket, staring down at the shattered pieces of the coffee mug still scattered across the hardwood floor. He had played along to buy himself time, but the game was far from over. If Rachel was lying to him about the twins, he was going to find out the absolute clinical truth. And if she had truly used him as a convenient biological scapegoat, he was going to make sure she lost everything. While David was secretly orchestrating his clinical fertility test, his aggressive divorce attorney was busy launching a separate attack on me. I was sitting at the desk in my hotel suite reviewing offshore financial records when a courier arrived. He handed me a thick legal envelope sealed with the crest of a prominent Chicago law firm. I opened it and read the official petition with cold amusement. David was oblivious to his impending medical crisis and still operating under the delusion that he could intimidate me. His lawyer filed a formal lawsuit demanding $15,000 a month in spousal support. The petition was a masterpiece of absolute fiction. It claimed David had been the primary breadwinner during our early years and willingly sacrificed his promising sales career to support my corporate ambitions. He painted himself as a devoted husband, being cruelly discarded and left destitute by an ungrateful wife. He wanted to bleed me dry using the legal system to secure the lifestyle he just lost. He expected me to panic and offer a massive cash settlement to make the lawsuit disappear. Instead, I called my legal counsel. I instructed my attorney not to negotiate or offer a single cent. I told her to schedule an official recorded deposition for the very next morning, so we could end this game immediately. The deposition took place in a corner conference room at my attorney's downtown office building. The room was designed to be intimidating, featuring a long, polished mahogany table, thick leather chairs, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the vast expanse of the city skyline. I arrived early, wearing a tailored navy blue suit, and sat quietly next to my lawyer. We waited in silence as the court reporter set up her recording equipment. David walked into the room 10 minutes late, intentionally trying to project an air of superiority and dominance. He was accompanied by a slick, aggressive-looking man in an expensive gray suit who strutted into the room like he had already won the entire case. David sat directly across the table from me, wearing a smug, arrogant smirk that made my stomach turn. He leaned back in his heavy leather chair and crossed his arms, looking at me with a sickening mixture of fake pity and victorious satisfaction. He honestly believed he held all the legal leverage. He thought he was about to secure a permanent monthly paycheck that would allow him to move Rachel into a beautiful new house while I financed their fraudulent life together. The court reporter officially started the record, and the red light blinked on. David's lawyer launched into a loud, theatrical opening statement. He listed David's supposed sacrifices and outlined the outrageous financial demands, boasting they were prepared to drag my name through a brutal public trial if I did not agree to their exorbitant alimony terms right then. I sat perfectly still, letting the man talk himself into a corner. When he finished his aggressive speech, he leaned across the table and demanded, "I surrender my complete financial disclosures, so they could calculate exactly how much of my income David was legally entitled to take." I looked at my attorney, who nodded in approval. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a certified financial portfolio. I slid the document across the smooth mahogany wood. David's lawyer grabbed it eagerly, expecting to see the standard salary of a forensic accountant. As he flipped open the cover and began reading the verified numbers, the confident smirk on his face began to falter. He turned the page and his eyes widened in shock. He looked up at me and then back down at the paper, unable to process the massive figures printed in front of him. David noticed his lawyer's sudden shift and leaned over to look at the document himself. For 10 years, David assumed I was just a well-paid employee. He never bothered to ask about my investments because he was too obsessed with his flashy leased cars and superficial status symbols. The portfolio revealed the undeniable truth. I was not just an accountant working for a firm, I was the silent majority partner in a highly lucrative private equity and financial consulting firm based in Chicago. My net worth was astronomical. I was worth 8 times what David assumed. David stared intensely at the bottom line of the verified asset report. His eyes grew wide with sudden overwhelming greed. The initial shock of my hidden wealth instantly transformed into pure, unadulterated avarice. He realized in seconds that I was a multimillionaire many times over. He looked at his lawyer, and I could see the greedy calculation running through his mind. He was no longer thinking about $15,000 a month in alimony. I was suddenly dreaming of taking me to trial and claiming half of my entire business empire. He sat up straighter, adjusting his suit jacket, his face flushing bright red with the thrilling anticipation of an incredible financial windfall. He opened his mouth, ready to loudly demand half of everything I had built. Before he could speak a single word, I reached back into my leather briefcase. I pulled out a single, pristine manila folder and placed it gently on the center of the table. I told David that I had one more vital document to submit to the official record today. I slid the folder across the table toward his stunned attorney. 5 years ago, David landed a single massive sales account at his old job. He received a large bonus check that made him feel incredibly important and powerful. Driven by his own fragile arrogance and desperate need to feel superior to me, he marched into our kitchen and demanded we sign a post-nuptial agreement. He told me he needed to legally protect his future sales bonuses from me in case our marriage ever fell apart. He wanted to make absolutely sure I could never touch his money. I agreed immediately, without a single argument. I offered to draft the legal paperwork myself to save us expensive attorney fees. He eagerly signed the final document without bothering to have his own lawyer read the fine print because his massive ego completely blinded him to the details. David's attorney opened the manila folder and began to rapidly read the contract. The color drained out of the lawyer's face so fast he looked physically ill. The document was an ironclad, legally flawless post-nuptial agreement. It explicitly stated in plain binding language that in the event of documented marital infidelity, neither party was entitled to seek spousal support, alimony, or any division of business equity whatsoever. It was a complete and absolute financial firewall that could not be breached. I looked at David, watching the deep confusion spread across his face as his lawyer slumped back heavily in his chair. I stated for the official record that I had already submitted date-stamped photographs and hotel security logs proving David's ongoing physical affair with Rachel. I explained clearly that because his infidelity was fully documented and completely undeniable, the punitive clauses of the post-nuptial agreement were entirely activated. The lawyer looked at David with a mixture of professional disgust and absolute defeat. He closed the folder and pushed it far away from him. He understood immediately that there was no legal loophole to exploit. The contract was completely bulletproof. David's lawyer turned pale, realizing he was not going to get a single cent of the massive fortune sitting on the table. I was representing a broke client who had just signed away his right to millions of dollars 5 years ago out of pure foolish arrogance. David asked his lawyer what the document meant, his voice trembling with raw panic. The attorney did not look at him. He stated for the court reporter that his client was officially withdrawing the petition for spousal support, effective immediately. David gasped, gripping the edge of the mahogany table like a drowning man. The magnificent fortune he had been dreaming about vanished completely. He realized with crushing certainty that he was walking away from our marriage with absolutely nothing. He had no home, no equity, no alimony, and no future. He was entirely ruined. I stood up from my chair, buttoning my blazer with calm, deliberate movements. I did not offer any parting words of sympathy. I picked up my briefcase and walked out of the conference room, leaving David to choke on the ashes of his greed. As I stepped into the bright hallway and headed toward the elevator, my phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out and looked at the screen. The anonymous sender from the previous night had followed through. A new encrypted message was waiting for me. It contained a specific time and an address for an upscale, secluded tea room on the outskirts of the city. The trap was ready to be set. The morning air was crisp and biting as I drove away from the towering skyscrapers of downtown Chicago, heading toward the wealthy, secluded suburbs on the outskirts of the city. The address provided in the encrypted message belonged to an exclusive, highly private tea room known for catering to the city elite. It was a place where old money went to hold quiet conversations away from the prying eyes of the press and the public. I pulled my car into the pristine valet circle, handing my keys to a uniformed attendant before stepping through the heavy brass doors of the establishment. The interior was a masterpiece of understated luxury, featuring dark wood paneling, thick sound, absorbing carpets, and plush velvet seating arranged to maximize privacy between tables. The air smelled faintly of bergamot and expensive floral arrangements. The hostess greeted me with a practiced, discreet nod and led me toward a secluded alcove in the far back corner of the room. Waiting for me at a small marble table was a woman who commanded the space simply by sitting in it. She was in her early 50s, radiating an aura of sharp, absolute authority. Her posture was rigidly perfect. She wore an impeccably tailored charcoal suit that likely cost more than my first car, and her dark hair was styled with severe precision. This was Monica, the wife of the billionaire real estate tycoon and political candidate. She was a woman who had spent decades navigating the treacherous waters of high society and cutthroat political campaigns. She did not look like a grieving, betrayed spouse. She looked like a general preparing to coordinate a massive military strike. As I approached the table, she did not offer a polite smile or extend her hand for a warm greeting. She simply gestured toward the empty chair across from her. I sat down, placing my leather briefcase on the floor beside me. A waiter appeared almost instantly, pouring hot tea from a silver pot into delicate porcelain cups before vanishing back into the shadows. We sat in silence for a long moment, measuring each other across the small table. I could see the sharp, calculating intelligence in her dark eyes. She was assessing my composure, searching for any signs of emotional fragility or unpredictable hysteria. She found none. I maintained her gaze with the exact same cold, analytical detachment I brought to my corporate audits. We were two women united by a profoundly humiliating betrayal, and we both understood that tears would not solve our current problem. Monica leaned forward, slightly crossing her arms and resting her elbows on the edge of the marble table. She did not waste a single second on meaningless pleasantries or hollow expressions of sympathy regarding the sudden, violent end of my marriage. She reached into her designer handbag and withdrew a thick, heavy manila envelope, placing it directly between our two porcelain teacups. She placed her manicured hand flat on top of the envelope and told me that her husband believed he was invincible. She stated that powerful men often mistake their wealth for intelligence, and that arrogance always leaves a very distinct trail of careless mistakes. She lifted her hand and gestured for me to examine the contents. I picked up the envelope, feeling the weight of the physical evidence inside. I opened the unsealed flap and pulled out a stack of 8 by 10 glossy color photographs. The images were incredibly crisp, taken from a professional distance using a high-quality telephoto lens. Every single photograph featured a bright red digital timestamp in the bottom right corner, verifying the exact date and time. I stared at the top photograph, feeling a surge of cold validation wash over my entire body. It was an image of my sister Rachel standing on a private, secluded sidewalk. Standing just inches away from her was Kevin, the billionaire political candidate. The background of the photograph clearly showed the discreet entrance to an exclusive, highly expensive VIP fertility and women health clinic. I slowly flipped through the stack of photographs, watching a silent, violently aggressive argument unfold, captured frame by frame. In the second image, Kevin was pointing his finger aggressively directly in Rachel, face's expression contorted with raw panic and fury. In the third image, Rachel was laughing, a cold, mocking expression that I recognized instantly from our childhood when she knew she held the upper hand in a dispute. She was holding her designer purse tightly against her stomach, adopting a protective, defiant posture. The final image in the sequence showed Kevin turning his back on her, running his hands frantically through his hair, while Rachel walked away with her head held high, completely unbothered by his obvious distress. The photographs perfectly corroborated every single piece of digital financial evidence I had downloaded the previous afternoon. I placed the glossy images back onto the marble table, lining them up in a neat chronological row. I looked up at Monica, acknowledging the sheer, undeniable power of the physical proof she had just handed me. I told her that these photographs perfectly matched the dates of the massive offshore wire transfers I had already tracked. I explained that I knew about the Delaware Shell Company and the $10,000 monthly payments flowing directly into my sister bank accounts. Monica did not look surprised by my revelation. In fact, the corner of her mouth twitched upward into a very small, approving smile. She told me she had specifically sought me out because she knew I was a senior forensic accountant, capable of handling complex financial data without crumbling under emotional pressure. Monica picked up her teacup and took a slow, deliberate sip before setting it back down on its matching saucer. She began to explain the precise sequence of events that led her to hire a professional operative to shadow her husband. She told me that managing a massive political campaign required absolute financial transparency and rigorous oversight. 6 months ago, she began reviewing the internal expenditure reports for Kevin Exploratory Committee. She possesses a highly trained eye for administrative inconsistencies, and she immediately noticed a series of deeply troubling discrepancies buried deep within the marketing and outreach budget allocations. Funds were being quietly diverted, disguised as vague administrative costs, and funneled out of the primary campaign accounts. She knew her husband was not a detail-oriented man, and she realized he was recklessly trying to siphon campaign resources to cover a massive personal liability. Monica did not confront him with her initial suspicions. She knew that alerting a liar to your awareness only teaches them to build a stronger, more deceptive lie. Instead, she quietly hired a highly discreet former federal investigator to follow Kevin movements outside of his official political engagements. She instructed the investigator to monitor his private meetings, track his secure communications, and document every single interaction he had with individuals outside his established professional circle. Within 3 weeks, the investigator presented Monica with the first set of photographs showing Kevin meeting secretly with a young blonde Pilates instructor from the suburbs. Monica stated that she watched the entire sordid affair unfold from the shadows, gathering irrefutable ammunition, while her husband paraded her across debate stages and television screens promoting his pristine family values. Monica leaned closer across the small table, her dark eyes burning with intense, chilling focus. She told me she intercepted a deeply panicked communication between Kevin and his legal counsel just 2 days ago. She stated my financial theory was absolutely correct, but it was only a fraction of the catastrophic truth. Monica revealed that when Rachel first informed Kevin about the unexpected pregnancy, he immediately transferred a lump sum of $100,000 into her account. The payment was designated to secure a discreet private abortion and completely sever their dangerous connection forever. Instead of terminating the pregnancy, Rachel took the massive payout and kept the babies. She weaponized the pregnancy, launching a ruthless, calculated extortion campaign against the billionaire politician. Monica explained that Rachel is currently demanding a permanent multi-million-dollar silent settlement to be paid in full right before the election. Rachel knew Kevin would lose everything if the scandal broke, so she held his political career hostage. But Rachel needed a bulletproof way to hide the children from public scrutiny, ensuring no one would suspect they belonged to a wealthy politician. She needed to legitimize the pregnancy, shielding herself from invasive questions while she quietly collected millions in extortion money. She manipulated David, my desperate, vulnerable husband, using his bruised ego to convince him he was the miraculous father of her twins. Monica folded her hands together on top of the marble table. She looked at me and offered a completely devastating alliance. She proposed we combine our financial data and physical evidence to orchestrate a public reckoning that would simultaneously destroy Kevin's political career and annihilate Rachel's extortion scheme, leaving them both with nothing. Monica did not ask whether I wanted revenge. She asked whether I wanted the truth exposed in a way that could survive lawyers' denials and a public relations war. That distinction told me exactly what kind of ally she would be. I opened my briefcase and removed the encrypted drive containing Rachel's financial records. I placed it beside the photographs on the marble table and explained what I had already traced. 14 monthly payments of $10,000, a Delaware shell company, overlapping legal agents, and a transaction path that led back to Kevin's real estate empire. Monica listened without interrupting. When I finished, she took out a slim laptop and opened a secure campaign accounting portal. Her evidence reached beyond the affair. Kevin had used vendors connected to his political operation to disguise several personal payments. Some funds had been labeled as communications consulting, voter research, and private event security. The descriptions were false. The money had been redirected through service companies before reaching the structure that paid Rachel. Monica had preserved original reports, internal approval emails, and the dates Kevin personally authorized each transfer. I studied the records and felt the case move from humiliating family scandal to potential financial crime. Rachel had not merely slept with a married man. Kevin had not merely cheated on his wife. They had built a concealed payment system around a political campaign and then used David as a public shield for the resulting pregnancy. I told Monica about David's sterility and Barbara's revelation. Monica's expression did not change, but her fingers stopped above the keyboard. "Has he confirmed it independently?" she asked. "Not yet, but he will," I replied. "His ego will force him to test the claim even if he pretends to believe Rachel." Monica considered that for a moment. "Then we do not contact him. If he discovers the truth himself, his reaction cannot be blamed on us. That was the first rule of our alliance. We would not manipulate David or warn Rachel. We would allow their own lies to bring them to the point of collapse." Monica opened another folder. Inside were drafts prepared by her attorneys after Kevin's legal team discovered Rachel had ignored the abortion agreement and demanded more money. The first document was a cease and desist letter identifying repeated extortion demands. The second preserved text excerpts in which Rachel threatened to identify Kevin publicly as the father unless he transferred a multi-million-dollar settlement before Election Day. The third authorized immediate civil action and referral to prosecutors if she continued. I read every page carefully. The language was controlled, precise, and devastating. It established motive, knowledge, and escalation. Most importantly, the documents showed that Kevin knew the twins could be his. No one could dismiss the affair as an old relationship unrelated to the pregnancy. Monica also produced confirmation of the $100,000 payment Kevin had sent after Rachel informed him she was pregnant. His lawyers had described it as a confidential medical settlement. Rachel accepted the money after representing that she would end the pregnancy and sever contact. Instead, she kept the payment, continued the pregnancy, and began demanding a far larger sum. "That transfer must be displayed with the monthly payments," I said. "It changes the story from an affair into a documented scheme." Monica nodded. "And the medical clinic photographs connect the payment to the pregnancy timeline." We began arranging the evidence in the order an ordinary person could understand it. Financial investigations often fail in public because experts present too much complexity at once. I reduced the structure to 5 clear. Kevin and Rachel conducted a secret relationship. Kevin financed her through a shell company. Rachel became pregnant. She accepted $100,000 under a medical agreement. Then she used David to legitimize the twins while demanding millions from Kevin. I warned her that exposing Kevin would damage more than his campaign. His companies could face lender scrutiny, partners might invoke morality clauses, and investigators could examine every vendor payment. Monica looked at me without hesitation. "He built his public career on using me and our children as evidence of his character," she said. "I will not protect the weapon he used against us." Her answer carried no theatrical anger. It was colder than anger. She had already separated the man she married from the liability he had become. We agreed that the evidence needed 3 forms of protection. I would maintain encrypted copies of the financial records and provide them to my attorney. Monica would place the original campaign documents with independent counsel. A third sealed package would be delivered to a former federal investigator with instructions to release it if either of us was threatened or pressured into silence. I asked whether Kevin knew Monica had contacted me. "No," she said. "He believes I am still trying to preserve the campaign." "Good," Rachel believes I am grieving. David believes he can still extract money from me. Susan believes public shame will force me to surrender. Every one of them is relying on the wrong version of us. We discuss timing. A private confrontation would allow Kevin to deploy attorneys and Rachel to manufacture another story. A quiet legal filing would take months and give Susan time to portray me as a jealous sister. The destruction had to occur where Rachel's claim of a legitimate family carried the greatest value. Monica asked whether my mother was planning a public celebration. I told her Susan could not resist displaying a victory, especially one she believed proved Rachel had surpassed me. If there was a baby shower, engagement announcement, or family event, she would invite every person whose approval she had chased for years. That is where the facade matters most, Monica said. Break it there and Rachel loses her leverage before she can replace the story. We established strict limits. We would reveal records, not private medical details about the unborn children, beyond what was necessary to challenge paternity. We would not publish clinic files, addresses, or information unrelated to the scheme. We would not make unsupported accusations. Every statement would be tied to a document visible on the screen. Monica's attorneys would finalize the cease and desist letter and prepare a short declaration confirming the authenticity of the photographs and payment records. My lawyer would review the presentation for defamation exposure and ensure the evidence had been obtained legally. I would build the timeline and explain the money trail. Monica would appear only after Rachel denied the evidence, giving the room an independent witness Rachel could not dismiss as a bitter sister. What about Kevin? I asked. He will receive notice at the same moment the evidence becomes public, Monica replied. My counsel will freeze access to jointly controlled accounts, notify the campaign treasurer, and demand preservation of every financial record. He will be too busy trying to save himself to rescue her. We left the tea rooms separately. Monica used a private exit while I waited before returning to the valet circle. On the drive to the Four Seasons, I uploaded the evidence to my attorney's portal. Confirmation was waiting when I reached my suite. I spent the next hour merging our respective arsenals. I paired each $10,000 deposit with Rachel's movements and Kevin's campaign schedule. I matched the $100,000 payment to the clinic photographs. I added the cease and desist draft, the extortion excerpts, and the shell company ownership chain. Then I created a clean public version that removed account numbers while preserving dates, amounts, and names. The correlation was absolute. The presentation did not require speculation. It told the story through documents created by the people who had committed the deception. I was labeling the final encrypted folder when a sharp knock sounded against the heavy door of my hotel suite. I crossed the suite and opened the door. A uniformed courier stood in the hallway, holding an electronic signature pad and a large cream-colored envelope sealed with an elaborate gold crest. I signed for it, closed the door, and carried the package to the desk. The envelope looked expensive enough to contain an invitation to a royal wedding. Inside was a professionally printed announcement for a baby shower and engagement party honoring Rachel and David at Pinecrest Country Club that Saturday. Susan had reserved the grand ballroom, requested formal attire, and added a line describing the event as a celebration of love, miracles, and the family's future. A handwritten note was tucked behind the invitation. Anna, Rachel and David are building a beautiful new life together. As family, it is your responsibility to support them during this joyous time. Come to the shower and apologize for the horrific, selfish way you treated them. Bring a substantial check to prove you still care about this family's future. If you do this, I might be willing to forgive your terrible behavior. Susan. I read the note twice, not because I misunderstood it, but because the arrogance deserved to be documented accurately. My mother had invited me to celebrate my husband's affair, demanded that I apologize to the people who betrayed me, and ordered me to finance their fraudulent pregnancy. She still believed public pressure would return me to the role I had played for years: silent daughter, emergency checkbook, permanent scapegoat. I photographed the note and uploaded it to the evidence folder. Then I opened my laptop and searched the municipal property registry for Susan's address. My mother had always treated financial appearances as if they were actual wealth. She wore designer clothing purchased during seasonal sales, leased cars she could not comfortably afford, and spoke about home equity as though it were cash sitting in a vault. I knew she had refinanced more than once, but I had never examined the latest records because her finances were not my responsibility. The new filing had been recorded 9 days earlier. Susan had taken out a massive reverse mortgage against the suburban home she had owned for 30 years. The loan consumed nearly all remaining equity and carried substantial origination fees, insurance charges, and mandatory repayment conditions. The available proceeds had been deposited into her checking account shortly before Pinecrest received its first payment. I pulled the linked public records and reconstructed where the borrowed money had gone. A large deposit had been paid to the country club for the ballroom catering, security, and audiovisual equipment. A second payment went to a luxury event planner. Smaller charges covered imported flowers, custom invitations, a string quartet, a champagne package, and an ice sculpture shaped like twin baby blocks. Susan had also paid the retainer for David's failed alimony lawsuit. That discovery made me pause. David had marched into the deposition acting like a man backed by serious legal resources. In reality, my mother had risked her retirement home to finance his attempt to take money from me. She expected the lawsuit to produce a settlement large enough to repay everything. When the post-nuptial agreement destroyed his claim, the debt remained with her. I reviewed Rachel's commercial records again and found another document that had not appeared in the earlier portal search, a notice of default filed by the studio's equipment lender. The notice accelerated the outstanding balance and scheduled repossession of the reformers if payment was not received by Monday morning. The landlord had also issued a final demand for overdue rent. Rachel had less than 4 business days to cure both defaults. The monthly payment from Kevin had kept the studio barely alive, but the pregnancy dispute had interrupted the latest transfer. Without another infusion of cash, the business would lose its equipment, its lease, and any remaining ability to generate income. I added the dates to my timeline. The entire family's financial survival depended on 3 assumptions. Rachel would obtain a multi-million-dollar silent settlement from Kevin. David would remain publicly committed to the twins, and I would eventually pay whatever Susan demanded to preserve the family's reputation. If any one of those assumptions failed, the structure weakened. If all 3 failed at once, it collapsed. Susan had not borrowed against her home to help a daughter in an emergency. She had gambled the house on a public performance. I opened the RSVP card and checked yes. The decision did not come from impulse. Pinecrest was the exact setting Monica and I needed. Susan had gathered the people whose admiration gave Rachel's cover story: value extended family, social club members, business owners, campaign donors, and former colleagues of David. The invitation also confirmed that professional audiovisual equipment would be available. My mother had unknowingly rented the mechanism of her own exposure. I called my attorney and read the invitation aloud. She instructed me to preserve the original envelope and note, avoid making any statement that went beyond authenticated evidence, and carry duplicate copies of every document. Monica's counsel joined the call through a secure line. We finalized the sequence of the presentation and agreed that Monica would enter only after Rachel denied the financial records. Then I prepared the public file. The first slide would show the Delaware company registration and the legal agents connecting it to Kevin's conglomerate. The second would display 14 monthly transfers of $10,000. The third would show the $100,000 payment Rachel accepted after disclosing the pregnancy. The fourth would pair clinic photographs with the payment dates. The fifth would contain Rachel's written settlement demands and the cease and desist response. I removed complete account numbers, home addresses, medical identifiers, and any information unrelated to the scheme. Every remaining fact could be independently verified. Next, I created Susan's package. I purchased a navy leather presentation binder and arranged the documents with the same precision I used in corporate fraud meetings. The opening page was the reverse mortgage filing with the principal amount, fees, and remaining equity highlighted. Behind it, I placed the Pinecrest deposits, the event planner invoice, and the payment to David's attorney. The next section contained Rachel's studio debts, the landlord's final demand, and the lender's notice scheduling repossession for Monday. The last section contained the shell company, records, the wire transfers, and copies of the clinic photographs. I included no emotional letter. The numbers were more effective than anything I could write. I placed the binder inside a pristine white gift box and tied it with a wide silk ribbon. From the outside, it looked like an extravagant present for the expecting couple. Inside was a complete audit of the financial disaster Susan had created. Before sealing the box, I calculated the likely outcome. If Susan could not replace the borrowed proceeds, interest and fees would continue consuming the remaining value of her home. If she violated the loan conditions or failed to maintain required expenses, the lender could accelerate repayment. Even if foreclosure did not happen immediately, she had sacrificed the safety she believed the property guaranteed. Rachel's position was worse. Her studio could be stripped of equipment. Monday, her landlord could terminate the lease, and the public exposure of the Kevin payments would make new financing nearly impossible. The business Susan expected David to support was already days from operational collapse. I printed 3 copies of the presentation, encrypted 2 flash backups, and placed the primary file on my tablet. 1 copy went into my briefcase. 1 was delivered to my attorney. The final copy remained with the independent investigator Monica had retained. By Thursday evening, every document was secured and every sequence had been tested. I set the white gift box beside my crimson suit and looked at the gold-foiled invitation one final time. Susan had asked me to bring a substantial contribution to the family's future. Unlike the borrowed money financing her celebration, the evidence required no repayment plan, no approval, and no faith in promises made by people who had already lied to everyone. I was going to bring the truth. While I was assembling the evidence at the hotel, David arrived alone at a discreet fertility clinic 2 towns away from Barbara's house. He had booked the appointment under a false name, used a secondary email address, and paid the expedited fee with the last available balance on one of his credit cards. He wanted answers quickly, but he did not want Rachel or Susan to know he had asked the question. He had barely slept since Barbara shattered the coffee mug and told him the truth about the mumps infection. During the day, he performed belief. He rubbed Rachel's stomach, discussed nursery colors, and allowed Susan to describe the pregnancy as a miracle. At night, he lay awake in the guest room, replaying his mother's face. Barbara had not sounded jealous or confused. She had sounded terrified for him. The clinic's waiting area was designed to be calm, with pale blue walls, soft instrumental music, and framed photographs of smiling families. To David, every image felt accusatory. Men held newborns against their chests. Couples smiled beside ultrasound pictures. Each photograph represented the identity he had spent 10 years trying to claim. A nurse called the false name he had entered on the form. David followed her down a narrow hallway without correcting it. She verified the identification information, reviewed the testing procedure, and asked whether he wanted the results sent to another physician. He declined. No one else was supposed to see them until he decided what to do. The examination and collection process stripped away the swagger he normally used to control a room. There was no audience, no blame, and no comforting miracle. There were only form specimen labels and the quiet machinery of a laboratory that could not be persuaded by his ego. Because David requested expedited testing, the clinic processed the initial analysis that afternoon and completed the confirmatory screening the following morning. He returned wearing the same suit he had used for the deposition, although the jacket now hung loosely across his shoulders. He sat in a small consultation room and stared at an anatomical chart while he waited for the specialist. The doctor entered carrying a thin manila folder. He was an older man with a careful voice and the restrained expression physicians use when they already know the patient will remember every word. "David," he said, sitting behind the desk, "I reviewed the complete semen analysis, hormone panel imaging, and genetic screening." David leaned forward. "I need a direct answer." The doctor opened the folder and slid the report across the desk. "The findings are definitive. There is no sperm present in the sample. The imaging is consistent with severe permanent testicular damage following the childhood infection described in your medical history." The condition is non-obstructive azoospermia. David looked at the highlighted laboratory line. The reported count was 0. He asked whether stress could affect the result. The doctor explained that stress might alter certain fertility measures, but it could not create this finding. David asked whether the sample could have been mislabeled. The doctor showed him the chain of custody record and the matching identifiers from collection through analysis. David asked whether surgery medication or an expensive specialist could restore his fertility. The doctor shook his head. "I am not telling you conception would be difficult," he said. "I am telling you there is no biological evidence that you have ever produced sperm. Based on the damage and the corroborating tests, there is 0% chance you fathered a pregnancy naturally." The word naturally gave David one final place to hide. He asked whether someone could have used stored material from years earlier. The doctor reviewed the records David had provided and confirmed there was no stored sample prior extraction or fertility procedure involving him. "There is no medical route by which you fathered the twins you described," the doctor said. The silence inside the room became absolute. David stared at the report while 10 years of resentment rearranged themselves in his mind. He had blamed me for every failed cycle. He had sighed when pregnancy tests were negative, withdrawn after clinic appointments, and allowed me to believe my body had denied him a family. He had never demanded to see his own complete childhood records. He had accepted the version of the story that protected his masculinity and placed the burden on me. Then Rachel had offered him the one thing he wanted most. She had told him he was fertile, desired, and powerful. He had not asked for proof because the lie made him feel superior. He had used that lie to humiliate me in my own home. Now the same lie reduced him to a convenient name on a birth certificate. The doctor asked whether David wanted counseling information or a referral to a specialist who worked with infertility trauma. David heard the words but did not answer. Humiliation arrived first, hot and suffocating. He pictured Rachel standing beside him at the penthouse with her hand on her stomach. He remembered Susan praising him for choosing a real family. He remembered the country club invitations already mailed to former colleagues, relatives, and wealthy acquaintances. Then humiliation hardened into rage. His first impulse was to return to Barbara's house, throw the report in Rachel's face, and demand the identity of the biological father. He imagined Susan defending her, Rachel crying, and both women insisting the laboratory had made a mistake. In a private room, they would still control the audience. Rachel could invent a new explanation, delete messages, move money, or flee. David folded the report into precise thirds. The doctor watched him with concern. "You should not make major decisions while you are in shock." David slipped the paper into the interior breast pocket of his suit. "I have already made too many decisions without facts." He left the clinic without scheduling another appointment. In the parking garage, he sat behind the steering wheel for nearly 20 minutes. His phone displayed several messages from Rachel asking him to approve floral arrangements and a photograph Susan wanted printed beside the gift table. Another message called him Daddy and included 2 heart symbols. He did not confront her. Instead, he replied that everything looked perfect. During the drive back, David constructed a performance. He would accept the congratulations pose beside Rachel and behave like the proud father she needed him to be. He would allow her to stand before the largest possible audience at the highest point of her triumph. Then he would use the same pregnancy she had weaponized against me to expose her. I did not know about Kevin, the shell company, Monica, or the extortion demands. His revenge was narrower. He wanted one answer delivered in front of witnesses. If the twins could not be his, whose were they? When he returned to Barbara's, Rachel met him in the foyer, carrying fabric samples for the nursery. David smiled, kissed her cheek, and told her he had spent the afternoon handling final divorce paperwork. She accepted the explanation without suspicion. Susan called from the dining room and asked whether he was ready for Saturday. David placed one hand over the pocket containing the report. "I would not miss it," he said. For the next 3 days, he played the role flawlessly. He attended the final country club walkthrough, approved the engagement announcement, and thanked guests who called early. Rachel interpreted his calm as surrender. Susan interpreted it as devotion. Barbara alone noticed that his eyes no longer softened when Rachel spoke. On Friday night, David removed the report from his jacket and made 2 copies. He placed one in a sealed envelope inside his suitcase and returned the original to his breast pocket. He wanted proof available, even if Rachel tried to tear it from his hands. Then he stood before the guest room mirror and practiced the only sentence that mattered. I am completely sterile. By the time Saturday arrived, the medical truth no longer felt like a wound. It felt like a weapon waiting for a microphone. While I was meticulously preparing my presentation, David was putting on the greatest performance of his entire life. It was Saturday morning, the day of the lavish country club shower. He stood in front of the vanity mirror in his mother's guest bedroom, adjusting the knot of his expensive silk tie. His hands were completely steady. The frantic, panicked energy that had consumed him earlier in the week was entirely gone. It had been burned away by the cold, absolute certainty of the clinical medical report folded neatly inside the interior breast pocket of his suit jacket. He patted the pocket, feeling the paper against his chest. The knowledge of his permanent, irreversible sterility was no longer a source of deep, paralyzing shame. It had transformed into a weapon. Rachel walked out of the adjoining bathroom wearing a stunning, incredibly expensive designer maternity dress made of flowing blush pink chiffon. Susan had paid for the dress, naturally using the borrowed equity from her doomed house. Rachel spun around, placing her hands delicately over her flat stomach, offering David a bright, beaming smile. She asked him how she looked, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. David turned to look at the woman who had effortlessly destroyed his marriage and manipulated his deepest insecurities for her own financial gain. He did not scream. He did not confront her with the medical truth. He walked across the room, wrapped his arms around her waist, and kissed her on the cheek. He told her she looked radiant. He told her he was the luckiest man in the world. Rachel leaned into his embrace, oblivious to the venom coursing through his veins. She honestly believed she had completely secured his loyalty. She thought the brief moment of doubt regarding his mother's medical warnings had been fully extinguished. She patted his chest, right over the pocket containing the lab results that would obliterate her world. David smiled down at her, his eyes entirely dead. He offered his arm, and they walked out of the guest room, ready to play the roles of the perfect expecting couple. By early Saturday afternoon, Pinecrest Country Club had been transformed into a monument to Susan's vanity. The grand ballroom glowed beneath imported crystal chandeliers. White orchids and blush roses towered above every table. A string quartet played near the windows overlooking the 18th green, and an ice sculpture shaped like twin baby blocks stood at the center of a seafood buffet surrounded by vintage champagne. Susan had invited nearly 200 guests. The room contained every audience she considered important: country club members, wealthy neighbors, distant relatives, former colleagues of David, local business owners, and several donors connected to Kevin's campaign. She had not organized an intimate family celebration. She had built a stage on which Rachel's pregnancy could become proof that the golden child had won. I arrived wearing a tailored crimson suit and carrying the white gift box tied with silk ribbon. My tablet and duplicate documents were secured inside my briefcase. I handed my car keys to the valet, entered through the mahogany doors, and paused long enough to study the room. Rachel sat on an ornate velvet chair at the center of the ballroom. Her blush pink maternity gown had been designed to emphasize the visible curve of her stomach. She accepted gifts while photographers captured each smile. A display behind her showed enlarged ultrasound images beneath gold lettering that read, "Twice the miracle." David sat beside her in a dark suit, one hand resting against the back of her chair. To the guests, he looked composed and protective. I noticed the rigid line of his shoulders and the way his fingers touched the breast pocket of his jacket whenever Rachel leaned close. The medical report was there. Susan moved through the crowd in a new designer pantsuit, accepting compliments as though she had personally created the twins. She described David as a successful provider, Rachel as a courageous future mother, and the party as the beginning of a powerful new family. Each claim depended on facts she had never bothered to verify. Barbara stood near the edge of the room. Unlike Susan, she was not celebrating. Her expression was strained, and she watched David more often than she watched Rachel. When our eyes met, she gave me a small, uncertain nod. She did not know what I had discovered, but she understood that the evening would not end as Susan planned. I walked toward the gift table. Conversations weakened as guests recognized me. Some looked away, embarrassed to be attending a party celebrating my husband's affair. Others stared openly, eager to witness a confrontation. Susan noticed the change in the room and followed their attention toward the entrance. Her smile disappeared. She crossed the ballroom quickly and intercepted me beside a towering arrangement of orchids. "You came," she said through clenched teeth. "You invited me." Her eyes dropped to the white box. Satisfaction returned immediately. "I am glad you finally decided to behave like family. Give me the check before you upset Rachel. It is not a check." Susan's mouth tightened. "Do not make a scene. This day is not about you." I looked beyond her at the ballroom she had purchased with borrowed equity. "I agree." She reached for the gift, but I moved it out of her grasp. "I will give it to you when the time is appropriate." Susan lowered her voice. "You will apologize publicly. People know what you did to them. You threw a pregnant woman out of her home. They were given 3 hours to leave property that no longer belonged to them." Her face flushed. "Rachel is carrying your husband's children." I held her gaze. "That statement will be addressed today." For the first time, uncertainty crossed her expression. Before she could question me, the event planner approached and reminded her that the formal program was about to begin. Susan forced her smile back into place. "Stand in the rear and do not interrupt," she whispered. "After the speeches, you can present your contribution and ask Rachel to forgive you." She turned away without waiting for an answer. I carried the gift box to a table near the audiovisual station. The country club technician checked a laptop connected to the 30-foot screen behind the stage. My attorney had already confirmed that guests could display family presentations through the system. I introduced myself, told him I had a short tribute approved for later, and asked him to verify the tablet connection. He tested the cable, saw the first neutral title slide, and nodded. Across the room, Monica's investigator stood near a service corridor pretending to review messages on his phone. Monica herself had not entered. She would wait until Rachel denied the evidence. The quartet finished its piece. Servers closed the ballroom doors and dimmed the lights slightly. Susan stepped onto the small stage and tapped a spoon against her champagne flute. The bright conversations faded. "Family and friends," she began, lifting the microphone with practiced confidence. "Thank you for joining us on this extraordinary day. We are here to celebrate love renewal and 2 precious lives that have already brought our family closer together." Polite applause moved through the room. Susan spoke about storms that supposedly revealed true character. She described Rachel and David as brave enough to choose love despite cruel opposition. She never used my name at first, but every sentence was aimed at me. She praised Rachel for possessing the warmth, courage, and devotion required to build a home. She praised David for refusing to remain trapped in a marriage that could not give him the future he deserved. Several guests shifted uncomfortably. Then Susan looked directly toward the rear of the ballroom. "Some people believe success can be measured in accounts, contracts, and cold numbers," she said, "but a real legacy is measured in children's sacrifice and family." Her supporters applauded more loudly. I remained beside the orchid arrangement with one hand resting on the white gift box. Susan mistook my stillness for shame. She smiled and continued. "For many years, our family waited for this blessing. Rachel gave us hope when others gave us disappointment. She reminded us that true love always prevails." Rachel dabbed at her eyes for the photographers. David did not smile. Susan announced that the event was also an engagement celebration. A waiter rolled forward a silver tray holding 2 champagne flutes and a small velvet ring box. Rachel turned toward David, expecting him to stand and complete the performance. He remained seated for 1 extra second. The delay was small, but I saw panic flicker across Rachel's face. Then David rose, kissed her cheek, and accepted the ring box. He did not open it. Susan laughed nervously and told the audience that the proud father was overwhelmed. Barbara pressed one hand against her mouth. Susan raised her glass. "Today we welcome a real beautiful family into our lives. And now I would like David, the devoted father of these miracle twins, to share a few words." The applause began. David stood beside Rachel and slowly adjusted his jacket. His fingers passed over the folded medical report inside his breast pocket. He looked at the ultrasound display, then at the guests who had gathered to celebrate his supposed victory. Finally, he walked to the stage. Susan handed him the microphone. He accepted it with one hand while the other reached inside his jacket. The room settled into expectant silence. No one understood the celebration had already reached its end. He walked to the stage with measured steps, his posture rigid. He took the microphone from Susan, offering her a tight, polite smile. David stood beneath the stage lights, holding the microphone in his right hand. For several seconds, he said nothing. The applause faded into scattered coughs and the soft movement of chairs. Rachel smiled up at him, but the confidence in her expression had begun to strain. "Thank you, Susan," he said. "You have spent a great deal of money making today look perfect." David looked across the ballroom. "Rachel and I have also spent a great deal of time asking everyone to believe something extraordinary." He reached inside his jacket and removed a folded sheet of hospital stationery. Rachel's fingers tightened around the arms of her velvet chair. "David, what is that?" He did not answer her. He unfolded the paper slowly and flattened it against the podium. "For 10 years I believed my former wife and I could not have children because something was wrong with her," he said. "I allowed that belief to shape our marriage. I allowed it to become resentment. When Rachel told me she was pregnant, I treated the pregnancy as proof that I had finally found the right woman." The room became uncomfortable. Several guests looked toward me, David continued. "I did not ask the questions I should have asked, because the answer made me feel important. I wanted to believe that I was fertile, that the twins were mine, and that leaving Anna was justified." Rachel rose from her chair. "This is not the time for private medical information." David turned toward her. "You made it public when you invited 200 people to celebrate my children." Susan hurried closer to the stage. "David, darling, everyone understands you are emotional. Put the paper away and enjoy your day." Barbara stepped forward from the edge of the ballroom. "Let him speak." Susan glared at her. "You have caused enough damage." "No," Barbara said, her voice trembling but audible. "I caused damage when I hid the truth from my son." A murmur moved through the guests. David looked at his mother. "Tell them." Barbara hesitated. Then she faced the room. "When David was 12, he suffered severe complications from mumps," she said. "The doctors told his father and me that the damage to his reproductive system was permanent. We were advised that he would never father a child naturally." Rachel shook her head. "That was decades ago. Medicine changes." David lifted the hospital report. "That is what you told me." I explained that after Barbara's revelation, he had scheduled an independent examination at a licensed fertility clinic. He stated the date of collection, the date of the confirmatory analysis, and the name of the specialist who reviewed the results. He held up a second page showing the laboratory chain of custody identifiers. Rachel moved toward the stage. "You used a fake name. That test could belong to anyone." David had anticipated the argument. He removed his driver's license and placed it beside the report. "The clinic used a patient alias for billing privacy. The specimen identification number, date of birth, signature, and identification verification are attached. My attorney received a certified copy this morning." Susan tried to take the microphone. David stepped away from her. "This is inappropriate," she hissed. "Rachel is pregnant. Stress could harm the babies." "The babies are not harmed by facts," David replied. He read the diagnosis aloud: non-obstructive azoospermia caused by irreversible testicular damage. He explained that the analysis found no sperm and that the specialist had ruled out obstruction, laboratory error, and any realistic natural conception. "For anyone unfamiliar with the term," David said, "it does not mean my chances are low. It means the count is zero." Rachel began crying. "The doctor who treated me said miracles happen. He said there was still a chance." "Which doctor?" She froze. David waited. Rachel looked toward Susan. "I do not remember his full name. The clinic handled everything." "What clinic?" Her tears intensified. "Why are you interrogating me in front of everyone? Because you announced in front of everyone that I was the father." Rachel reached the bottom of the stage and grabbed his sleeve. "We can discuss this privately, please. You are frightened and confused." David looked down at her hand. I was confused when I believed you. David's voice tightened. My mother kept this diagnosis from me because she believed she was protecting me. Anna and I entered fertility treatment without the complete truth. I blamed Anna for failures that were never hers. Rachel knew how desperate I was to believe otherwise. I did not know about your childhood illness, Rachel shouted. David looked at her. You knew enough to lie about a 1% chance before I ever showed you this report. The room reacted immediately. Guests whispered to one another, recognizing the contradiction. Rachel's face drained of color. David stepped away from the podium and held the report toward her. When I confronted you at my mother's house, you did not ask what illness she meant. You did not ask whether I had been tested. You immediately claimed a doctor had given us a 1% chance. That means you had already prepared an explanation. Susan placed an arm around Rachel. She was terrified. You were attacking her. I asked one question, David said. Whose children are they? They are yours, Rachel insisted. The test is wrong. David turned to the guests. I repeated the analysis. He lifted another certified page. The second laboratory reached the same conclusion. David explained that his attorney had verified both facilities and retained sealed copies of the results. He had not altered the documents, and the country club could preserve the recording of his statement. If Rachel wished to challenge the reports, she could do so in court under oath. That final phrase changed the atmosphere. This was no longer a private accusation. David was inviting legal scrutiny. Rachel backed away. He looked at the ultrasound photographs displayed behind her. You brought those images into Anna's home. You stood beside me while I told my wife of 10 years that you were giving me the family she never could. You watched me sign away my marriage, my home, and my future because you knew exactly which lie would control me. His anger broke through the calm in his voice. You did not only betray your sister, you used my infertility as camouflage for another man. Rachel shook her head so violently that her earrings struck her neck. There is no other man. David unfolded the report completely and held it high enough for the front tables to see the clinic letterhead physician's signature and highlighted conclusion. Then explain the biology. She said nothing. Susan tried to redirect the room. She claimed jealousy had poisoned both families and demanded that the staff stop the event. No one moved. Even the country club manager remained near the wall watching. David returned to the center of the stage. I wanted this pregnancy to be a miracle, he said. But a miracle is not an excuse to ignore evidence, and love is not a reason to accept fraud. He looked directly at Rachel. I am completely, permanently, and irreversibly sterile. 2 independent laboratories confirm there is 0% chance I fathered these twins. The microphone captured every breath in the silent ballroom. So Rachel, David said in front of the family, friends, donors, and colleagues you invited to celebrate my children, answer the only question that remains. He paused. If I am not their father, then who is? Rachel opened her mouth, but no answer came. The silence gave her one final opportunity to invent a story. I did not allow her to use it. He is right, I said. My voice carried from the rear of the ballroom. Every head turned as I lifted the white gift box from the table and walked toward the audiovisual station. Rachel stared at me with naked panic. The tests are not wrong. The country club technician stepped aside. I connected my tablet to the ballroom system and selected the prepared presentation. The 30-foot screen behind the stage changed from the gold ultrasound display to a plain title, The Actual Financial Record. Rachel lunged toward David. Make her stop! He moved beyond her reach. I picked up a wireless microphone. Susan invited all of us to celebrate a miracle, a new engagement, and the future of this family. Before anyone contributes money or congratulations, you deserve to know what that future is built upon. The first slide displayed the Delaware registration records for the shell company. I identified the registered agent, the associated legal billing address, and the connections leading to Kevin's commercial real estate conglomerate. The presentation removed full account numbers, but preserved dates, names, and corporate identifiers. Rachel shouted that the documents meant nothing. I advanced the slide. 14 wire transfers appeared in chronological order. Each payment was exactly $10,000. Each originated through the Delaware structure and entered Rachel's accounts under the description private consulting fees. This is how Rachel's Pilates studio remained open, I said. Not through successful classes and not through David's income. The studio is more than $200,000 in debt. These payments financed the illusion that Rachel was an independent businesswoman. Susan gripped the edge of a cocktail table. I showed the studio's tax filings beside the transfers. The payments had been misclassified, partially omitted, and routed through multiple intermediaries. Then I displayed the equipment lender's default notice and the landlord's final demand. The studio's reformers are scheduled for repossession Monday morning. Its lease is also in default. Rachel's expression turned from fear to fury. You stole private business information. The records shown here are public filings, shared marital records, authenticated payment documents, and materials preserved by legal counsel, I replied. Nothing on this screen requires anyone to trust my opinion. I changed the slide. A single payment of $100,000 filled the display. The date matched the week Monica's investigator photographed Rachel and Kevin outside the private fertility clinic. This was not a monthly consulting fee, I said. Kevin transferred $100,000 after Rachel informed him she was pregnant. His lawyers documented the payment as part of a confidential medical agreement intended to end the pregnancy and terminate contact. Gasps moved through the ballroom. Rachel screamed that I was lying. The next slide showed the clinic photographs. In one image, Kevin pointed at Rachel with panic visible across his face. In another, Rachel held her bag against her stomach while laughing at him. The timestamps matched the transfer. I displayed excerpts from Rachel's later communications. The identifying phone numbers had been redacted, but the dates and authenticated language remained visible. Rachel demanded a multi-million-dollar settlement before Election Day. She threatened to identify Kevin publicly as the biological father and expose the prior payments if he refused. David looked at her as if he had never seen her before. You told me the twins were mine, he said. Rachel backed away. Those messages are taken out of context. The context is on the next slide, I said. The cease and desist letter appeared bearing the letterhead of Monica's attorneys. It ordered Rachel to stop all extortion demands, preserve communications, and prepare for civil action and criminal referral. The letter specifically identified the pregnancy, the $100,000 payment, and the attempt to use another man as a public paternity cover. The room erupted in shocked conversation. I raised my voice above it. Rachel needed a father who would legitimize the twins while she pressured Kevin for money. She chose a man desperate to believe he had finally overcome 10 years of infertility. She used David's ego, my marriage, and Susan's obsession with appearances to build a cover story. Rachel pointed at me. You are jealous because he chose me. I looked at David, then back at her. He did not choose you. You selected him as camouflage. David flinched as though the sentence had struck him physically. Susan climbed onto the stage and demanded that the country club turn off the screen. The technician looked toward the manager, who did not intervene. Several campaign donors were already photographing the evidence. This is a family matter, Susan shouted. No, another voice said from the back of the ballroom. It became my family's matter when your daughter tried to extort my husband. The mahogany doors opened. Monica entered wearing a charcoal suit beneath a dark designer coat. The crowd recognized her immediately. Her face had appeared beside Kevin's at rallies, fundraisers, and televised debates. Conversations died as she walked down the center aisle. Rachel went completely still. Monica stopped several feet from the stage and addressed the room without taking my microphone. The documents are authentic, she said. My attorneys prepared the letter. My investigator took the photographs. The payment records were preserved from accounts connected to my husband and his companies. Rachel shook her head. Kevin loves me. He said he was leaving you. Monica's expression remained calm. Kevin said whatever prevented you from speaking before the election. She informed the guests that her legal team had notified the campaign treasurer, ordered preservation of all vendor records, and frozen access to jointly controlled funds. An independent review would determine whether political accounts had been used to conceal personal payments. Kevin had received notice minutes earlier. Several donors began leaving the room while making urgent calls. Monica continued. Your leverage depended on secrecy and on the appearance that David fathered the twins. Neither exists now. Rachel looked toward the exits. Country Club security had moved beside the doors, not to detain her, but to prevent the screaming confrontation from spilling into other events. I advanced to the final slide. It showed the complete timeline in 6 simple entries. Affair monthly payments, pregnancy disclosure, $100,000 transfer, David paternity cover, multi-million-dollar demand. No accusation depended on speculation. The dates aligned across bank records, photographs, legal correspondence, and public campaign events. I switched off the presentation. The ultrasound images did not return. The screen went black, reflecting Rachel's silhouette on the stage. David removed the engagement ring from the velvet box Susan had prepared and placed it on the podium. I destroyed my marriage for a lie, he said. I will not spend another day inside it. He stepped away from Rachel. Susan reached for him. Think about the babies. They were never mine. Rachel turned toward Monica, then toward me, searching for someone she could threaten or manipulate. She found no opening. The guests who had praised her minutes earlier now watched with shock, disgust, and fascination. Phones were raised throughout the room. The public facade she needed for the extortion scheme had become evidence against her. Her knees buckled. She covered her face with both hands, but there was no private corner left, no loyal audience, and no believable story capable of protecting her now. Rachel sank onto the stage, the silk of her maternity gown pooling around her as the entire ballroom erupted. The humiliation hanging in the ballroom was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket that pressed down on every single person present. David stood at the very edge of the small stage, his shoulders slumped, his chest heaving with ragged, uneven breaths. He looked down at the microphone, still gripped tightly in his right hand, as if he no longer understood what the object was. The disgust radiating from him was palpable, a physical force that made the air around him feel extremely cold. I was entirely broken, a man who had sacrificed his marriage, his integrity, and his home for a mirage constructed by a manipulative extortionist. He looked at Rachel one final time. There was no anger left in his eyes, only a profound, hollow emptiness. Without uttering another syllable, David simply let go of the microphone. It plummeted to the polished marble floor with a deafening sharp crack that echoed violently through the vaulted ceilings, causing several guests in the front row to physically flinch. He turned his back on the complete wreckage of his new life and stormed out of the venue. He did not look at Susan, he did not look at Monica, and he certainly did not look at me. He just marched toward the heavy mahogany exit doors, pushing them wide open and disappearing into the dark night, leaving Rachel sobbing hysterically on the stage. On the makeshift platform, my sister was completely unspooling. She had collapsed onto the floor, her remarkably expensive blush pink custom silk maternity gown pooling around her knees like a deflated parachute. She was weeping frantically, her hands clutching at her face as her makeup ran down her cheeks in dark, jagged streaks. She wailed for David to come back, her frantic cries bouncing off the walls, entirely ignored by the 200 elite guests, who were now actively backing away from the stage as if her deceit were highly contagious. The wealthy socialites, corporate executives, and extended family members were no longer whispering politely. They were openly staring, their faces distinct masks of shock, revulsion, and morbid fascination. A few women from the country club board were already pulling out their cell phones, rapidly texting the scandalous details to anyone who had missed the catastrophic event. The glittering illusion of the perfect suburban family had been meticulously dismantled, laid completely bare for the entire elite community to actively judge. Near the towering arrangement of white orchids, Susan stumbled backward. Her face had lost all its vibrant color, taking on a sickly, translucent pallor. Her knees buckled and she collapsed heavily into a plush velvet chair, frantically clutching her chest. She was hyperventilating, struggling to pull air into her lungs, as she watched her carefully cultivated social standing instantly vaporize in front of her country club peers. Decades of relentless social climbing, of kissing up to the right people, of pretending her family was vastly superior to everyone else, were completely obliterated in a matter of terrible minutes. She was no longer the envied matriarch. She was the mother of a confirmed fraud, a woman who had unknowingly funded a highly criminal blackmail operation. I watched my mother gasping for breath in that velvet chair surrounded by the judgmental glares of the wealthy women she had spent her life trying to desperately impress. There was a time when seeing her in such distress would have immediately compelled me to rush to her side to offer comfort, to enthusiastically try and fix whatever pressing problem was plaguing her. I had spent my entire adult life playing the role of the reliable, completely unappreciated fixer. But that exact version of me no longer existed, having been systematically eradicated by their countless betrayals. I adjusted the crisp cuffs of my tailored crimson suit, the expensive fabric perfectly smooth against my wrists. I walked slowly across the marble floor, my heels clicking rhythmically, a steady measured beat cutting sharply through the chaotic noise of the room. The large crowd parted for me, instinctively stepping quickly aside to let me pass. I calmly walked over to my mother, leaning down to directly speak over the suffocating chaos. I did not offer her a glass of cold water. I did not ask if she needed prompt medical attention. I brought my face very close to hers, invading her personal space, so she was violently forced to look me directly in the eyes. Her gaze was frantic, wild with absolute panic, desperately searching my face for the compliant daughter she used to easily manipulate for her benefit. "By the way, Mom," I whispered coldly, making absolutely sure my distinct voice carried only to her ears over the ambient chaos of the ballroom. "I checked the public records yesterday afternoon. You leveraged your retirement home to the absolute maximum limit to proudly pay for this lavish party. The expensive floral arrangements, the exclusive catering, and David's massive legal retainer." Susan's eyes widened in sheer terror, her rapid breathing hitching dramatically as the brutal reality of her financial situation finally crystallized. I kept my voice perfectly level, surgical, and lethal in its precision. "Since David just walked out on your golden daughter, and since Rachel's failing Pilates studio is officially being foreclosed on by the commercial bank tomorrow morning due to massive unpaid debts, you have absolutely zero financial safety net. I highly suggest you stop crying over your ruined reputation and instantly find a remarkably good bankruptcy attorney first thing on Monday. You are desperately going to need one to survive this total mess." I did not wait for her eventual response. I did not need to see the final crushing realization of total ruin wash completely over her face. I straightened my posture gracefully, smoothing the front of my crimson jacket. I turned my back on the pathetic screaming, the hysterical tears, and the absolute financial and social ruin I had deliberately left in my wake. I walked out of the country club, my heels clicking rhythmically against the polished floor. The heavy front doors swung open, welcoming the cool, crisp night air. I stepped outside, happily leaving the toxic, suffocating atmosphere of my past behind me forever. The cool breeze washed over my face, carrying away the lingering remnants of a lifetime spent foolishly trying to earn the love of people who were fundamentally incapable of giving it. For the very first time in my entire life, I felt truly liberated. The false narrative they had aggressively written for me was finally burned to ash, and the ashes were scattering in the wind. A week later, the scandal had moved far beyond Pinecrest Country Club. Kevin suspended his campaign after major donors demanded an independent accounting of the shell companies and vendor payments connected to Rachel. Monica's attorneys filed for legal separation, froze disputed joint assets, and delivered the preserved financial records to investigators. Kevin's public statement called the matter private, but the bank transfers, clinic photographs, and campaign-linked invoices made privacy impossible. Rachel's Pilates studio did not open Monday morning. The equipment lender removed the reformers under the default notice, and the landlord changed the locks after the unpaid lease deadline expired. Without Kevin's payments, David's support, or access to my money, the image of the successful entrepreneur disappeared within days. Susan called repeatedly. Her messages shifted from rage to bargaining and finally to panic. She insisted that losing her home would destroy the family, as though she had not mortgaged it to celebrate the destruction of mine. I forwarded every financial message to my attorney and blocked her number. David also left voicemails. He apologized for blaming me for our infertility, for forging my initials, and for using Rachel's pregnancy to humiliate me. He said he understood too late that I had carried the shame of our failed treatments while he protected his ego. I believed he regretted the consequences. Regret, however, was not the same as repair. I deleted the messages without responding. The divorce was completed under the post-nuptial agreement. David received no alimony and no share of my business equity. The forged mortgage remained with his legal problems exactly where it belonged. Barbara sent one brief message accepting responsibility for hiding David's diagnosis and apologizing for the harm her silence caused me. I did not answer immediately, but I saved it instead of deleting it. On Friday morning, sunlight filled the windows of my corner office while I reviewed the quarterly performance of my firm. My phone remained silent for the first time in years. No one was demanding a rescue, an apology, or a check. I had spent too long believing that endurance was the price of family. It was not. Loyalty without boundaries becomes permission, and forgiveness without accountability becomes financing for the next betrayal. Evidence did not make me cold. It gave me a way to stop carrying consequences created by other people. I closed Rachel's file, archived the final divorce documents, and returned to my work. True independence was not winning their approval. It was no longer needing it. If you have ever been expected to fund people who betrayed you, tell me in the comments where you finally drew the line. Like this story, and subscribe for more stories about women who protect their dignity, their future, and the truth.